fiat politics are rampant and people are very heavily identified with their favorite politician, with their favorite party, and they think, well, Kamala needs this and Trump. It's like, why? Why do we need one ape to rule 330 million apes? Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
People will come and say, look at how much poverty there is under capitalism. And this is a nominal error because those people would simply be dead under socialism. They would not exist in the first place. So it's an observational error. The idea of income redistribution is absurd because income was never distributed in the first place. Therefore, how could you redistribute it?
I know you've got some good individual rights and some nice accumulation of savings over here, but we're going to need to take some of that to serve this fictitious greater good. I think it's just the most sophisticated form of gang violence that humans know of, and we're still stuck under its spell.
And what is fascinating is that capitalism, although at the hands of modern socialists attained a bad name, capitalism is the only philosophy that allows you to care about people you've never met. The most important thing that we can do is to create a fair set of rules for everyone to play by. If I wish to profit and survive, I have one way forward, and that is to be of benefit to my fellow human beings.
The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism by Friedrich Hayek. You introduced me to this book, and like I was telling you offline, I think the title way undersells it. I'd only been exposed to Hayek previously through his essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, and then his book, Road from Serfdom?
The Road
to
to Serfdom.
Yep. To Serfdom. Road to Serfdom. And I found his writing like good. It's very informative, but it's often quite dense. This book is not an exception to that. But I liked other authors more, like Rothbard, Mises, etc. But I'm glad you recommended this one because I think this is definitely his most interesting work that I've seen so far. He's like, what year was he writing this? I mean, he's basically a complexity thinker before complexity theory emerged.
Yeah, this book was published in 1988, and he died in 1993.
Okay.
And I guess we could start with an interesting little controversy. This is definitely one of his most important works, and other economists will tell you that. The controversy is that he had an editor, Bartlett, and he was ill during the finishing of this book. And Bartlett died in 92, and Hayek died in 93. And so it's kind of a little unclear on the authorship, but the cool thing about this is that because it's Austrian economics, we can evaluate it on first principles. And this density that you feel, you know, it's amazing because Hayek's teacher is von Mises.
Yeah.
And we both know what reading human action is like.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like, so first of all, it's amazing. And you get to some pages where it's just truth bomb after truth bomb after truth bomb. But there's a lot of cutting through jungle and wading through mud. Yes.
Yeah.
And so what's amazing is this book is incredibly short, and it tells what I think is the most important story of our time. And in all the work that we've done together, I've only had one aspiration for humanity, and it's that sound arguments for liberty will be commonly available. And what a large part of the Fatal Conceit shows is that our language, our intellectual history, going all the way back to Aristotle and Plato and going through Rousseau, is totally poisoned.
Yeah.
And it is poisoned in a way that we cannot see the forces that actually shape civilization.
Yeah.
And before we came on, you and I, we had an interesting exchange about evolution. And I wonder if you'd start there and maybe we can use that to talk about what the Fatal Conceit is and how it destroys civilizations.
Yeah. So, you made a brilliant point about that. And I guess before getting there, you mentioned Aristotle just now, and that was the portion of the book I was listening to right before we started recording. Yeah, the fact that he was saying that, I guess autarky was his preferred model of order. And there was something about like humans could only be ordered within the sphere where they could hear the herald's voice, something like that. So like you needed one central commander and a group of people that could all hear him to have order according to Aristotle. But then Hayek was arguing, well, here's Aristotle living in the lap of luxury that's dependent on these extended trade networks where they had like, long grain trading networks, I think, with other societies that made, Aristotle's area rich, where he could, had the luxury and time to write things like this, but he didn't even see that. So it's something like the flaw of thinking that order must be imposed,
Correct.
rather than order can be emergent. And if anything, the modern perspective from complexity theorists, people like Benoit Mandelbrot, fractal geometry, self-organization, like in I guess, what does that fall under? Chaos theory, maybe? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's a whole complexity theory. There's a whole emergence. Those are all Santa Fe Institute kinds of topics.
But that and you could almost call this what he calls the extended order, which is basically order without design, right? Without conscious design. You could also maybe call that emergent order, right? It's just order that emerges without anyone trying to consciously make it emerge, I guess you would say. So I just wanted to make that comment about Aristotle, but you brought up the brilliant point before we hit record that this is largely, it's almost like an evolutionary perspective on the way culture changes, or the way is bridging the gap between natural biological evolution and cultural evolution. Something like it's the same process, but different substrate. One of the things I said to Jason Lowery a long time ago, and I probably got it through reading some of this stuff, but actually it was reading The Physics of Life. I think it may have been The Origin of Wealth, where he talks about innovation being essentially an evolutionary process, but it's happening in a different substrate. So it's like evolution is biological innovation. Innovation is non-biological evolution. It's like the same process, but different domains. So you were making the point that what Charles Darwin was arguing against, there are some parallels between what Hayek is arguing against. The other thing I thought was interesting there too is, which he said in this book, Charles Darwin was reading Adam Smith at the time he came up with his theory, which is obviously Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, the invisible hand, right, that moves markets. So yeah, maybe you could go through the point you were saying there again about the parallels between Darwinian theory and what Hayek has written here.
Yeah, so much to unpack there. I think let me start by succinctly stating what the fatal conceit is.
Yes.
And it is the philosophical and logical error of socialism. And it is the idea that wherever there is order, it must have been rationally and by implication centrally planned.
Yes.
And we'll unpack that. But I think the first leap in intuition for the listeners is to understand that when Darwin espoused the theory of evolution, he was arguing against an implied theory, which was the theory of intelligent design. And the leap he brought to the world was that there are some things that just happen, whether or not there's certainly no author in the anthropomorphic sense, that this is a process which runs. The selection criteria are fully dynamic, are constantly changing, and different byproducts evolve over time. And those species which persist are precisely the ones which succeeded this game of survival. So the theory of evolution was in apposition and in opposition to the theory of intelligent design. And what Hayek comes to say is that socialists make the same mistake in a different domain. And he says they, much like Aristotle, the Greek word is taxis or taxis, as in taxonomy. And Aristotle believed not only that order could only be attained in the reach of the herald's voice, which is almost Dunbar's number, whatever, a few hundred people the town crier can reach. And Hayek points out he was proven wrong in his own lifetime. And as opposed to society only being able to be centrally designed, there are certain processes that just happen. And this is now this book is a masterclass in things seen and things unseen, because not only because of our philosophy and our language, but because of how we think and how our thinking has evolved, it's very difficult to see this invisible hand that forms the extended order. And it's important to note that Hayek was so concerned with the poisoning of the language. Are you familiar with this term weasel word?
No.
So he uses weasel word, and he explains that's because weasels have the ability to hollow out an egg without damaging the shell.
Huh.
And so social is one of these weasel words. And he has their pages where there's literally, a list of 300 words that have been poisoned by social justice, a social order, social injustice. And what he points out is that word no longer means anything. And there's an invisible process which is received, and this is the key point, it is somewhere between instinct and what we know as reason, somewhere between instinct and reason.
Right.
And he calls it morality.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to give some examples because it's really hard to grasp this, because he's literally telling us about an invisible process that causes the market to work, causes civilization to be ordered, causes us to be able to go to work each day and affect millions of people around the globe through our economic actions without even knowing these people.
Right.
And what is fascinating is that capitalism, although it has, at the hands of modern socialists, attained a bad name, capitalism, or the extended order, is the only philosophy that allows you to care about people you've never met.
Yeah. Right.
Through the process of the market and through the process of the exchange.
Yeah.
But to bring that back to evolution, Hayek makes some really fascinating notes here. So not only was Darwin reading Adam Smith, but what Hayek shows is that economists had the concept of evolution and genetics before biologists did.
Mm.
And he goes through and unearths that history, and he shows that it's been hidden in large part to what started with Aristotle, went on through Plato, went all the way on through Rousseau and Mill, and all these people made a fundamental mistake. And what they said is that since the order that we have is designed, we can redesign it.
Mm.
But the mistake there is the order we have is not designed.
Mm-hmm.
At least it is an evolved order.
Right.
Okay. And this, I'm going to spin this back to you. This reminds me of some of the earlier work we did with Thomas Sowell, where Sowell said the idea of income redistribution is absurd because income was never distributed in the first place. Therefore, how could you redistribute it?
All right.
So the socialist comes, and under the influences of Descartes, rationalism, Comte, positivism, empiricism, all these well-sounding, well-meaning philosophies says, because this order is designed, we can design a better order. And that's simply not true. And that's going to be the subject of the conversation. But I want to give the ball back to you to kind of spin some of that around.
Yeah. I mean, the key point here, and it's again, the subtleties of language and semantics, I suppose. It's when he says not consciously designed, he's saying that no group of men sat down with a blueprint and laid out, this is the institution of private property. This is the notion of money. This is the rule of law. This is how everyone's going to interact, and put the plan in motion.
Right.
It was not top down. It's basically emergent. It's bottom up. It's this long sequence of experimentation, a lot of which we're passing forward the cultural knowledge largely through imitation, as he says, rather than rational discourse. And through that long process of experimentation, we sort of discover the things that work best, right? Like private property being one of these social institutions that is pretty much indispensable to human flourishing. And it's also discovered in different times and different places. So it's not which undermines the idea that it was ever centrally planned or top down imposed. So that's the big theme of the book. And then I think it's difficult for people to understand that because because we do live in a world where there is a significant top down influence, especially in 2024 when fiat politics are rampant and people are very heavily identified with their favorite politician or their favorite party. And they think the only solution to any problem is the passing of a fiat law and, all this nonsense. We've kind of gotten away from our roots in English common law and free markets. And we're really starting, now we have Kamala Harris advocating for things like price controls, right? Like the opposite of free market fundamentals. So I guess that would be the theme that we'll keep coming back to as we work our way through this book.
Yeah, and what I'd like to dilate on there is kind of the logical and empirical impossibility of socialism. And what I want to again establish is that everybody knows instinct. Okay, so instinct is what causes you to have a feeling of revulsion when you see blood,
Mhm.
or to pull your hand off of a hot stove.
Mhm.
There are others, the instinct to reproduce, the instinct to eat. There are so many primitive instincts. And what Hayek points out is that this non-rational function, again, which he calls morals, there's no good word. This is amazing. Throughout the book,
Yeah.
Hayek points out cases where the German language is even inadequate. And German is famous for being able to build kind of custom tailored words exactly for the situation. So the best he can do is morals. And he's not talking about religion. And I want to kind of dilate on that and give some examples. So he relies to some extent. We talked about, on the one hand, you've got Aristotle, Plato, Rousseau, and some of their successors, and they kind of propagated this era. But on the good side of things, you have philosophers like Hume and Sir Karl Popper, who started to refute these ideas of rationalism. And one of the conclusions of Hume and empiricism and positivism, all these kind of related, all of these philosophies have a common thread in them, in that they believe that unless you can justify an action, you should not undertake that action. Immediately, we should see that intuition is taken out of the picture. And we can start to think about a very important concept in all of Hayek's work, and it's the concept of dispersed knowledge. And what he says is that in order to act in everyday life, there's all different types of knowledge that only exists in people's heads and hearts, not even their rational head. And if we then say we have to totalize and centralize all this knowledge so that we can achieve a socialist utopia, we're saying we have to undisperse knowledge, and that is akin to driving a car over email.
Yeah.
Right? Like, can you imagine, like, oh, should I go right or should I left? Here, let me email somebody. And so it's not, and Hayek develops this concept of the man on the spot, who has to use the dispersed knowledge that only this person, this man, this woman, it doesn't matter your gender, happens to have at the moment. Oh, my daughter is allergic to these things. Let her not eat that. Like, no central planner is going to know the quirks and idiosyncrasies of the moment that you're in. And the important thing is that not only dispersed knowledge, but we defined pretty well what instinct was. Now, this faculty which restrains our instinct is the moral level. So it's not, Hayek is very careful not to commit the naturalistic fallacy. So he's not saying that what is pleasing is good. In fact, he sticks with Wertfreiheit, which is the valuelessness of Austrian economics. He's not making any value judgments. But what he says is that this moral layer, which is received through culture and through imitation, which is protected by religion, but is not the same as religion, has the role of restraining our instinct. And now is where things really start to get interesting. What we call our reason is a product of this morality. And it is a bootstrapping error, or a recursive error in some sense, if you will, to think that, oh, our reason, which was created by this moral process of evolution, I'm going to give a very specific example. Our reason is now able to modify its mother, right? So, and this is, I mean, akin to the idea that to take the human body, the entire industry of drug discovery and medicine is about unintended consequences, off-target effects, iatrogenics. Okay, so would you now propose to modify your own DNA with rationality? Like, no, it is the product of billions of years of evolution. And I want to give you an example, and I'm going to give a few. So what are examples of this morality? What Hayek calls several property. He specifically says, I don't want to say private property, and maybe you can help me. I think he says several property because that is not property. It's the understanding that property belongs to an individual is shared by a society. And this is critical. So several property, savings, honesty. These are examples of evolved moral practices that over time made some groups more successful than others. And all we can do in retrospect is reason about how these characteristics might have caused certain groups to succeed over others. But we cannot, because the future is unknown to us, because the contingencies of human action are unknown to us, we can't look forward into the future and project our rationality forward and say these are going to be the processes, largely because the conditions are unknown, that are going to make humans successful in the future. And I'll pause with this example. So, and we might have used this on a prior podcast, but I'm always striving for what are concrete examples we can give to people. And in the country of India, when you perform a holy ceremony or when you give a gift to somebody, you always do it with your right hand. And the reason is you wash your backside with your left hand. Now, at the time when this practice persists today in India, and it is a very serious deal. And at the time when this practice evolved, I don't know how many thousands of years old it is. I remember my mother teaching me this. And, again, whenever I participate in any of these family rituals, like this is something you do. You always give with your right hand, never with your left hand. It's considered insulting to do so. They didn't know with their rational minds that, oh, I'm spreading listeria and salmonella. Right. But in actual point of fact, although this seemed like a superstition, it was 100% a survival adaptation.
Right.
Nobody understood it and nobody needed to understand it.
Yeah.
And so the word I want to end with here is adventitious. Hayek is teaching us this, like a root that kind of goes everywhere, is that we don't know the future. We don't know the course of evolution. I mean, you couldn't have asked a single cell organism, what will mammals look like? We don't know the future. And so what Hayek is concerned with is preserving the extended order by making sure that enough individual freedom of choice is preserved so that people can try different practices and we can learn sometimes in many generations. The individual may not learn, but the species will learn. Sometimes in many generations, we can learn that, hey, this practice of honesty and savings was actually very important for survival.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. And again, going back to the book, I think it's in The Physics of Life or The Origins of Wealth. I'm confusing the two now, but one of the authors, two different authors, cites the algorithm of evolution, which is if it works, keep it. If it doesn't, discard it. And so that's what Hayek seems to be looking at here, is that there are these long processes by which we discover things, not necessarily with our rational mind, but more likely with just trial and error, right? And then we find a thing that really works for a given purpose. So for instance, those groups of people that discovered what he's calling several property, which I would just say is individualized property, basically, right? Like everything belongs to someone individually, and individuals are free to trade those things. That opens up the division of labor. That opens up additional economic prosperity. So the groups that do discover that principle and live by it will tend to economically outperform those that do not, such that over time, this principle or this idea of several or private property spreads, right? Because of natural selection, right? It's those that are economically favored by this principle will outcompete those that have not discovered it or adopted it. And so, and I love the example because it does come back to knowledge. And, I'd always point people to his essay, The Use of Knowledge in Society, where he's describing, how knowledge emerges, how we have to make use of it. It's the man on the spot, as you said. I love the example you gave of, I've never heard that one, driving a car by email.
Yeah.
Because that's effectively what you're trying to do in a centrally planned scenario, right? It's like, instead of you, the driver, taking in your sensory inputs on the spot as the pedestrians cross the street and the road curves and it starts to rain, all the factors of the environment are changing and you're adapting to them in real time. If you would imagine instead having to send an email off to some authority and asking permission, right? Oh, it's raining now. Can I turn my windshield wipers on? There's a pedestrian. Can I press the brake? The road's curving. Can I turn left? Knowledge loses all of its relevance and its accuracy and its actionability, I guess, when you have to send it off somewhere to get approved, basically. So what Hayek, as I understand it, is arguing for is like, we need to maximize the individual's ability to respond to any given set of circumstances, which that's one good definition of responsibility, is the ability to respond. And that's something he closely connects to property, right? That it actually makes people more responsible by giving them accountability over the things they own, which is not only the rights to enjoy their benefits, but also the responsibility to maintain these things. So, and yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now. I guess the other thing he does say at some point, I'll be paraphrasing now, but this process is natural in the sense that it's emergent, but it's not natural in the sense that there's a cultural element to it, right? Like it's like we're discovering principles that work for humans naturally, but it's the process itself has taken place in a cultural domain, right? That we've actually run these experiments over and over and over. It's not so much evolution that's giving us this, but it's more the domain of innovation, I guess. And maybe there's a continuum there. Like it's kind of hard because it's like discovery, right? Like what do you say when you discover the Higgs boson or whatever it is? Like, well, what is that innovation that got you there, or is that evolution that got you there? I mean,
yeah, and it's not only innovation but also everyday performance. And there's so much to unpack there in what you just said. But the first is that this idea, liberty is nothing like anarchy. And there's also it's not just innovation and adventitiousness. That's how strategies are evolved over time. But it's also the stability, the rules that you choose to live by.
yeah,
And by having more and more rules, several property, savings, honesty, we have a greater and greater capacity to divide labor, which is the force that creates wealth, which is then the force that creates population, which is then again the force that creates more wealth.
That's right.
And Hayek does a really neat thought experiment in this book. And he's like, if the entire world was reduced to 10,000 people, even if we retained all the knowledge, I mean, you can say goodbye to your iPhone. You can say goodbye to AI. Who's going to have time for that? Our existence will be forced. We'll be only thinking about subsistence because we simply don't have the manpower. So Hayek, and this is actually a really good point in that I talked about this lineage of thinkers who have misled us. Well, Malthus is one of them.
Yeah.
And Hayek he says that Malthus had the right model for the wrong world. And he said that in Malthus's world, there were only laborers and non-laborers in some sense. And he said in such a zero-sum world, sure, it would be the case that we will run out of resources. But in fact, in a world where we can continue to divide the division of labor finer and finer, we can continue. And he is a proponent of population growth. And he calls bollocks on Ehrlich and all these other thinkers who say that, we're in the midst of a population bomb. And well, let's think of ways to put this all together. So we've stated what the fatal conceit is, and it's the idea that order always comes by conscious design, what we know as central and rational planning. I want to talk about Descartes a little bit. And this error in Descartes, there's a book by Damasio, I believe is his name, by a neuroscientist. And looking at selective brain injuries, he shows that I think, therefore I am is a lie. Okay, and now so Descartes' cogito, I guess, is the foundation of rationalism. You could think that, right?
And subject-object duality.
Yeah, well, I want you to come back to that.
Well, he's just establishing subject and object when he says, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah.
Right, so the subject thinks about the objective world, and therefore he established himself as a subject separate from the objective world. Again, this is like a linguistic thing. The core lesson is like there is no separation, right? It's continuum. We're slicing it up with language to try and understand it.
So this becomes now, and it's ironic that you mentioned this before the recording, this Descartes' error becomes a study in the fatal conceit and in the evolution of morals. And here's how it works. The book Descartes' Error is about people with different brain injuries. And the first injury they discuss is a very famous one, the railroad worker Phineas Gage, who, as you know, had a railroad spike go through his skull. Okay. And it knocked out a particular part of his brain. And he was still able to work and he was still able to rationalize, but the emotional centers of his brain had been damaged. And as a result, he was totally incapable of functioning. It would be, by modern neuroscience alone, it would be much more correct to say, I feel, therefore I can think. And what this means is that when people lose the emotional centers of their brain, they lose the ability to live their everyday lives. Even though their ability to do concrete operations, mathematics, spatial operations is fully intact, they cannot exist. And this starts to give us a clue to how much of our existence is run by things that aren't conscious thought and are not instinct. Again, instinct will barely keep us at the level of cockroaches. And what these things include are the received behaviors that we act by, that restrain our instinct and that we use every day, but cannot possibly be the part of the thought of our rational mind. And this was, again, Hume's point, is that our moral traditions cannot be the product of our reason. In fact, the reverse is likely to be what's true. And so we can see, this is what I'm going to turn it over into. In cognitive science, in fact, this is really interesting. There's a guy named Don Norman. He wrote a famous book called The Design of Everyday Things. And another book which is on emotion and design. And what he points out is the brain has three levels: the visceral level, which is kind of like instinct; the behavioral level, which is the level of mastery; And this is Hayek's moral level in some sense,
Mhm.
and it has the rational level where we actually reflect.
Right.
If you took away let's take a concert pianist is actually they don't think about every note. They would
Mhm.
never finish
Sure. Right.
the concerto, right? They would never finish the concert. That is ingrained into their behavior. And so this is again to show is that what runs society is so much more than what is rational and encompasses
Yes.
what has evolved and what is received. And this is the important thing, what we cannot justify.
Yes.
And when you think about the pandemic and think about, well, why don't you want to take this therapy or whatever?
Mhm.
Well, I don't need a reason.
That's right.
I don't need a reason. And and the important thing, here's the crazy thing, and this word diversity is going to come up. The fact that what is necessary for the survival of the species is the preservation of optionality so that different groups can do as they please and we can observe the results.
Mhm.
And this is the key thing. And Hayek goes and shows this, and maybe I'll find the quote, that there are so many places where science is blind. Just because something hasn't been proven doesn't mean it's true. Point number one. We also know from mathematics that not only are there an infinite number of things which are true but cannot be proven, there are propositions that are undecidable.
Mhm.
And we also know that as soon as you aim for total completeness, you no longer have consistency. So this again
Yeah.
to say, neuroscience shows us that, hey, there is a visceral, a behavioral layer, right? Just as Hayek is saying, hey, there's this moral layer, and it's not just about rationality. And once you see this, you can't unsee it.
Mhm.
Because time and again, people will come. This is the example I'll end with before turning over to you. People will come and say, look, as an example, look at how much poverty there is under capitalism. And this is a nominal error because those people would simply be dead under socialism. They would
Mhm.
not exist in the first place. So it's an observational error.
Yeah.
And we time and again come to prosperity like the extended order that is evolved and then say, hang on, I have a good idea. I'm rational. Let me plot the course.
Mhm.
But such rationality can never be sufficient for a dynamic future.
Yes. Yeah. So in rationality, we have a much lower throughput data channel, basically, right? Like what rationality can comprehend. I'm going to call it imitation, I guess, that's between instinct and reason.
Yes.
Because I'm in the Rene Girard mimetic desire rabbit hole, and I'm pretty big on imitation being the primary means of cultural transmission.
Yeah.
So I'll go with mimesis or imitation. That there's a lot more data that can flow through that channel than can flow through the rational channel alone. We know even with infants, like within 36 hours of age, they are capable of mirroring their mother's facial expressions, for instance. So like it's something very deeply ingrained. It's pre-linguistic, pre-rational, right? To the extent you consider a 36-hour-old infant pre-rational. And this also called to mind I always go back to this quote by Alfred North Whitehead, which really resonates with what Hayek's writing. Whitehead writes, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking of them. So the whole, not the purpose of, the extensibility of civilization is in this automaticity or this automation that we're encoding into the system, right? Where we have protocols, right? Protocols for resolving disputes over scarce assets, for instance, right? We have the rule of law, we have private property. Even money is a protocol, right?
Right.
It allows us to understand the qualities of the world in a quantitative framework so we can calculate, execute, negotiate trades, and perform economic planning. In Bitcoin, we often dream about the idea of forming citadels, which are independent, self-sovereign communities that have their own energy, food, and water resources. Today, that dream is becoming a reality at the farm at Okefenokee. The farm is a 705-acre regenerative agriculture community located at the Florida-Georgia line near Folkston, Georgia. The farm is known as the healthiest place on earth, and it includes orchards, organic standing gardens, regenerative animal pastures, berry fields, and much, much more. Today, the farm features 25 custom-built cabins and has plans to construct 225 more in the years ahead. The farm has its own food, energy, and water sources and is completely off-grid. So if you're looking to join a Citadel community, comprised of sovereign individuals, then go to okefarm.com today to learn more about membership. Make sure to tell them that I sent you for a $21,000 discount on custom cabin pricing. Again, that's okefarm.com to learn more about joining this revolutionary regenerative agriculture community. Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE. Have you ever wanted to start a business in the Bitcoin space? If so, then the Wolf Startup Accelerator could be for you. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to businesses developing in the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times each year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. Go to wolfnyc.com to learn more or apply today. Again, that's Wolf, WOLFNYC.com. Yeah, the Malthusian thing. God, this one bothers me so much because, and I feel like this is the crux of why I think we're living and hopefully exiting the economic dark ages. That we have actual people in positions of power and authority, people in positions of great wealth that truly believe that this planet is overpopulated. I'm pretty sure you can take every human on the planet and fit them inside the state of Texas. I think there's actually more than enough room. Like people have, their own little plot basically. And then further to the point is like, if you understood classical libertarians, they would say that no, actually the larger the population and the more we have these simple rules and protocols between us, the deeper the division of labor will go and the more wealthy we will all be. Right. And to your point, it's like you could have all the knowledge we have today, but if you skim the population down to 500,000 or 50,000 or 10,000, well, we'd be toast, because ultimately all of this resource allocation boils down to human time, right? That's what we're actually doing. There's no, and Safety makes this point in his book, The Bitcoin Standard, there's no physical resource that is practically scarce. Like the real bottleneck is human time and how much time we allocate towards its production. And so ultimately that's what we're doing, is trying to allocate our time in a way that most satisfies the most urgent consumer wants, as Mises would probably phrase it. And the only way to do that is to give people, individuals, maximal freedom. But maximal freedom doesn't mean just this unrestrained, do whatever you want. It means that up until the point of theft, coercion, violence, right? Like the what's the classic one? My right to swing my fist stops where your face begins, kind of thing. It's like everyone has this absolute freedom, but they are restrained from stealing from or harming other people. And like, it's that restraint. I forget how Hayek phrases this. He goes, it's by means of that restraint that we free ourselves to pursue such, much wider ends, basically. So there's like a paradox of freedom built into this whole thing, that we have to actually restrain ourselves from certain coercive activities such that we can unlock the possibility of more peaceful, prosperous, and productive human life, basically.
Fascinating. So much to talk about there. You mentioned earlier this process of abstraction, and I guess there are at least 4 major examples that Hayek gives of systems that are evolved, have no central director. They are language, law, money, and science.
Yes.
Like there's no director of science. I
Yes.
mean, now there are people who try and interfere with this, but
Yeah.
science
Markets
just
as well,
happens.
right?
Markets, yes,
yeah,
yes.
yeah,
And that's the kind of the hardest one.
Yeah.
And one of the intellectual debts that we have to pay, and this is fascinating, the Romans, and I believe also the Greeks, considered the only honest occupation to be farming. And
Yeah,
again, remember, we're going
right.
back to Aristotle and Plato because they actually produce something.
Yeah.
Everything else where you're using even your physical labor, like to be a gladiator, it was considered that was considered a form of prostitution because you're using your body to please other people.
Yeah.
But nothing could be further from the truth. And what we're saying is that this is about the seen and the unseen, which we should talk about more. The broken window fallacy being an example of the unseen. Minimum wage laws being an example of the unseen. Like, well, the seen effect is these few people will be employed at a greater rate. And the unseen effect is the real minimum wage is 0 for the rest of the people because the total quantity of money in the economy doesn't actually increase. So these unseen effects are what guide the evolution of these processes. And you mentioned abstraction. And so it is because of the division of labor that I have the luck and great fortune to call myself a computer scientist. I mean, farming is a lifelong apprenticeship. I don't know anything about growing wheat or farming animals or husbandry.
Yeah.
And so this shows very precisely that the more rules we are able to adhere in society and the more abstract rules we're able to adhere in society, the freer we are to specialize at what it is that makes us unique. And Hayek goes so far as to say, as I can think of no counterexample to this idea where as the population becomes denser and denser, and there's a flywheel effect here. And what is it? The division of labor creates more wealth. Wealth creates the ability to have more progeny. More progeny creates the ability, more people along which we can divide. So there's a flywheel effect there. And we absolutely want more people and want more individuals. And this is, again, an evolved process. This is how evolution works. Whichever group produces the most people that is able to survive into the future is the group that is, this is not a moral problem. It happens in large part through the functioning of what Hayek calls morality, but it's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's about what survives over time. And this totally transcends our rationality. And in terms of abstractions, I want to, introduce this concept that money is the ultimate abstraction. And as Mises says, this is the common denominator for economic calculation. What does that actually mean? Can you imagine if I had to barter my way through existence? I'd be like, okay, this guy wants 3 eggs so I can get a 2x4. And with that 2x4, I'm going to trade it to this other guy for a basket of blueberries. I mean, this is absurd. But because we have the most saleable commodity over time, again, language, law, money, science, the market itself, because we have this abstraction and the rules of money, we are able to abstract our lives in a way that we can just press a button and make something happen. And so many interesting things here. What Hayek points out is that the Rousseaus of the world, and again, Soul also picks on Rousseau, because Rousseau famously said, man is born free and everywhere in chains. And what Hayek points out is that Rousseau is longing for, he calls it atavistic or regressive. Rousseau is longing for a tribal time when instinct reigns supreme. But that's actually going backwards. And he explains, when you belong to a primitive society or a pre-industrial society, you are subject to the whims of the headmaster or the chief, point number 1. You're constantly subverting your instinct for what is good for the group. And so Rousseau has created an absurdity by suggesting that freedom is to go backwards and to indulge in our instincts, when that is slavery to nature. Because the state of humanity in nature is poverty. The only system that produces abundance, and we can dispute this and happy to bring up the numbers, is capitalism and the extended order. And I want to read a quick quote from Hayek here. He says, after asserting that animal instinct was a better guide to orderly cooperation among men than either tradition or reason, Rousseau invented the fictitious will of the people, or general will. And this comes into Marx and socialism. We'll talk about that, through which the people, quote, become one single being, one individual. This is perhaps the chief source of the fatal conceit of modern intellectual rationalism that promotes to lead us back to a paradise wherein our natural instincts, rather than learned restraints upon them, will enable us, quote, to subdue the world, as we are instructed in the book of Genesis. And this error is nothing but animism. It's the belief that, society, it's what is animism? Animism is a belief that objects have their own purpose and their own consciousness. And this is exactly what Marxism does with society. It says, well, there's this common will.
Yeah.
And this common will is now capable of forging the extended order. And it's not.
No.
And this is one of the reasons why Hayek coined extended order, because social is a weasel word.
Yeah.
And Marx plays this game where he says that everything good that the collective needs to do, he attributes to society, and everything bad he attributes to the state.
Yeah.
And it's only by creating this false dichotomy that he's able to sustain this fantasy. Anyway, so many interesting threads there, but I hope what we're showing is that also inherent in our received philosophy and in socialism is this desire to return to a primitive state, but that is absolutely far from freedom, because that is eking out your survival. That is you against the elements. And without the extended order and without the division of labor, you will have to learn every skill necessary for survival. You will not be able to specialize, and you wouldn't have anything like what we call a modern or life worth living.
Yes. No, it's great points. And I was reminded here, there's one part of the book where he's talking about this word society and it being almost worthless because we actually exist in different layers, right? That there is the extended order that we're participating in, where we go to work to the benefit of people we don't even necessarily know, right? Like if you're working on a assembly line to create a good, you don't really know who the final consumer of that good is, right? But because of the extended order that's largely enabled, well, by all these things, the language, law, markets, money, science, right? All of these, these are really kind of open source software packets in a way, right? It's like these are just protocols we've developed for human interaction, discovery of things. They enable the individual to go to work and to the benefit of someone he'll never meet. But then in the home, right, there's still this like individual compassion, or let's say at the Dunbar's number level and below, that compassion still works because it's people that you know face to face and you interact with them on a day-to-day basis. But what was occurring to me is that that's the same compassion circuitry that the state tries to hack at that collective layer, right? They're always saying, hey, you know what? I know you've got some good individual rights and some nice accumulation of savings over here, but we're going to need you to take some of that to serve this fictitious greater good, right? Where Marx and others have basically converted the collective into a deity of some kind, or another individual, like. And so it's that subtle trick of language where people don't understand that they're participating in two different orders that the rhetoric of the state seems to exploit. And even when I say that, like even I'm saying that like the state, it's like, well, who's the state? Well, the state's different individuals, different times, different places. It's something that we like have to do for language to work, for us to be able to abstract and talk about these things in an economical way. However, if you start to mistake that, anthropomorphizing these things, you start to mistake that for the actual person. Like there's not an actual person called the state. There's not an actual entity called the greater good. If you start to take those things as real, then you can get very confused and very vulnerable to manipulation, basically.
Yeah, and very much because it appeals to our sense of family and our sense of instinct. And again, the great irony here is that socialism destroys the human will to create because it forces you to work on behalf of people that you don't know. But what did you just explain? You just explained that money and capitalism allow you to work for other people that you don't know. Anywhere in the world. Right. And again, thinking about iPencil, there's no single person in the world who knows how to make a pencil. The ferrule, the lacquer, the wood, the graphite. There are specialists that construct all these things. And yet for a few cents, it happens to come together. And this is the beauty of the transmission of information through the market process. And this is something that the market is not a place or a thing. It's something that we discover. You know, I was thinking about this the other day. So we had the basis point, 50 basis point cut from the Fed yesterday. And I'm watching CNBC. Actually, the woman next to me just came from a Morgan Stanley conference. I was on the plane to Miami. And she's watching, and I'm just watching all these talking heads. And I just see the number as 50 basis points, Powell. And they're showing the market. And I'm like, that's not the market. Like,
It's not a market,
what is they're showing like a bunch of people in a trading room. I don't even think anything is pit traded. Where the market is happening all over the world, we don't know the direction that it's going, but the best thing we can do is arrange the rules so that the entrepreneurs can satisfy the desires of the consumers.
Yeah.
And the market is this fully distributed process. And so we have this capacity to anthropomorphize and try and make things human scale. And this is the terrifying thing. So Hayek says that there's no good word in German or English for the quality that the extended order has. And the best one he comes up with in English is transcendence.
Yeah.
Okay. And this is the sense of awe, strangely, that capitalists have and theists have, and they're not required. Hayek himself was an atheist, and he goes on to say that in this book because he doesn't know what this word God means. But in a prior episode, we read Steve Jobs' one of his last emails where he's saying, I am greatly indebted. I love the species. I don't grow any of the food that I eat.
Yeah.
I don't create any of the medicines that I depend on for my survival. And here's, again, one of the most significant capitalists in the world explaining how capitalism is the philosophy of love and cooperation.
Yeah.
And it has been, Mises says very clearly, they call everything they don't like capitalism and proceed to reason that capitalism is bad.
Yes.
So this is this kind of painful process that we're in. But here's the interesting way to think about it. And this goes back to the difficulty of expressing the extended order in language. Hayek actually says, there's a German word, Machbarkeit, okay, which is the ability to make, machbar, I can make, and that the makeableness, okay, the makeability of something. Okay. And this is fascinating now. And he says, there so many of the things that we think of as constructed are not even constructed. And he gives the example. Let's take a molecule like ethanol or glucose that we manufacture. You can harvest these, you can manufacture them. Malic acid may be a better example. Nobody actually manufactures that. This is very important. We create the circumstances where the atoms are predisposed to arrange that thing. This is very important. Nobody goes atom by atom and says, oh, this is ethanol. That's prohibitively expensive, absurd to make things that way. And so what we're actually doing in a laboratory is we are inhering the conditions that allow things to arise.
That allows nature to do its thing largely.
And this is civilization.
Yeah.
Private, several property, honesty, savings, hard work. There are so many different kinds of, and this is why human beings are the single species on planet Earth that have a low time preference, that are able to defer their consumption. And this is why, and Hayek talks about this, it takes 20 years of a mom and a dad, in many cases, sometimes neither, hammering on this growing brain to inhere all of the evolution all of the morals that are required to run society. And the best we can do, this is the amazing thing so there's this invisible process. And first of all, I want people to pause and just, if they can, experience the awe of like, wow, I'm part of a world that I don't understand. There are people across the world working for me because we all value this thing called money. There are innumerable skills and knowledge that I don't have. There are things that are physically impossible to reason about, and yet the world functions. And the message is, again, much like we should not be under the illusion that anyone is synthesizing a compound. I mean, they are, but you have reactants and you have a catalyst. They are creating conditions where something can happen. And this is the nature of the extended order. And this is how we should understand civilization. The most important thing that we can do is to create a fair set of rules for everyone to play by. As soon as we start reasoning about what the outcome should be, we are now in the fatal conceit and saying that, oh, this is how the future ought to turn out. Well, that has no intellectual value and no predictive value. The fact of the matter is the way the universe works is you have to roll the dice and see. And when we did discrimination disparities, one of Sowell's everything by Sowell is a masterpiece, but what he showed is that the factors of success are in some sense randomly distributed, and you have to have all of them to succeed. So this is the adventitious discovery. And as we move towards a global economy, if we want global order and not chaos, we need to think about the common cultural constraints, the common morality that is going to allow the structures of the future that we cannot plan to arise. It's all about creating conditions. So the market is just a level playing field. It's a fair set of conditions. You participate in it through voluntary action. And it is the only engine of planning, I guess you'd call it distributed planning, that has the capacity to produce profit. And this is another thing. So there's this general mistrust of shamans. And if you're not a farmer, like in the Roman era, you're some kind of prostitute. Okay. And this is why people who engaged in trade, which is an amazing way to create value, but you don't actually produce anything. And if you can look, even if you watch movies today, the trader or the commerce guy is always the shyster. Okay. And Hayek goes through, in the philosophy of Greece, there was this concept of xenos, or the protector of foreigners. So it was a cultural practice to give, and you even saw this, if you're familiar with Marcus Luttrell, this Navy SEAL, it was Operation Red Wing, one of this. He was protected at the cost of his life. He was the only surviving Navy SEAL by a member of an Afghan tribe. That man protected him. And so all of this to say, there are all these evolved practices that we receive that together allow us to create together. I lost the train of thought a little bit there, but it's so rich. And I hope we can leave people with this sense of awe for how much is happening that is beyond the rational mind. And we must never fall into our own conceit by believing that we understand science so perfectly and we are so rational. And there's a bunch of nonsense arguments you'll read online about, oh, when we have quantum computers, we can do a market auction and figure out prices. It's not going to work. I'll just tell you that right now. Because we need the ability to tinker and discover. And we need to think about how we create conditions where the world can succeed. And Balaji's network state is very much about this. How do you have a series of conditions where a group of people can become powerful and in a way that allows them to project themselves in the future?
Yeah, there's another language thing there where it seems like central planning, right? People often sort of weigh this in one hand as if it's an alternative to individual freedom. But I think it's actually Hayek that says, no, that's not the case at all. It's centralized planning versus decentralized planning. To demonize central planning is to not demonize planning itself. Obviously, planning is a very necessary and important part of all of the things we're talking about: deferring consumption, building businesses, etc. You have to make plans. You have to test them against reality. You have to see where your intended outcome deviates from the actual outcome, and then you have to recalibrate and adjust, right? It is that tinkering, trial and error process by which we, navigate, circumambulate, I think would be the Jungian term for that, our way into the future, right? You're at A, you want to go to B. Well, you start going down the path and you get off the path. Then you have to reorient yourself and you get off the path again. You have to reorient yourself. It's constant, continuous process of trial, error, reorientation. So there's nothing wrong with planning per se, but central planning, we almost need a better term for it. I propose in one of my essays that we called it, it's often called collectivism, right? As a philosophy. I think he uses the term constructivism in here. I'm not sure.
Yes, I think constructivism is part of rationalism and positivism and some of these other kind of philosophies that failed us or blinded us to the extended order.
The idea that you can consciously construct a sound society, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. I like coercivism because it really points out the problem. It's like, no, well, to get a central plan to work, by definition, you're saying there's other people that have their own plans and they don't want to abide by that. So you have to go bludgeon them over the head and get them to comply, right? So you need coercion to make central planning operate. What I can't help but wonder, I mean, obviously, I probably haven't, I'm over-indexing on the monetary dimension of this, but money does seem to be, you could say private property, rule of law, these things all go hand in hand, but money is the lifeblood of the extended order. I mean, it is the thing that actually makes it work. And so what makes me really excited is to think that, wow, we have achieved this level of the global extended order, despite the fact that our money is so significantly impaired, right?
Yep.
We don't even really have, we have gold, which is like this geopolitical global money, but it's not an individual entrepreneurial global money, right? Most people participating in the market are using fiat currency to hold cash balances, to trade with one another, et cetera. So what excites me is the idea that we could, if the integrity of the money is, let's say, parallels the integrity of the extended order, or maybe the extensibility of the extended order, to what degree do we improve the world by improving the money, right? To what degree does this actually unlock a level of innovation and civilization that we just can't even fathom. And so, yeah, it's like, what's the other, another metaphor for this is like the global economy has a blood disease, right? If money is the lifeblood of the global economy and we don't have actual money flowing in the world, we have these unsecured debt certificates called fiat currency. To what degree does the global economic organism become more healthy when we remedy the blood disease through, obviously, Bitcoin?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you asked that. There's a little video of Hayek that you'll see in Bitcoin circles where he says, "I do not believe that we will ever have sound money until we take it from the hands of the state." And
the sly roundabout way.
The foundations of that quotation are actually laid in this book. And what Hayek says is exactly that, is that historically, and he gives, as only Hayek can, all the citations and many examples, government has always so thoroughly debased and destroyed money that they made this process of experimentation and this process of generating the extended order impossible. And he, as a then hypothetical or counterfactual, he says, if there were some magical way to wrest money from the hands of the state, we would have a better chance at the extended order continuing to generate wealth and division of labor continuing to generate wealth. And you were looking for this, you mentioned, so, okay, there's socialism, or instead of central planning, call it coercive economy. The other term for socialism is a command economy.
Yeah.
So the market economy on the one hand and the command economy on the other. And again, there are so many examples of this. And what the Austrian economists pointed out is that the Soviet Union only lasted as long as it did because the command economies were able to copy prices
imitation
from the capitalist economies, right? And even as Cuba is now in tatters, that applies to Cuba and other modern socialist economies as well. The small capacity that they have to see how the capitalist economies are functioning, strangely allows them to pursue their...
It's typically the pricing, right? It's the pricing czars that are trying to...
The exchange ratios and how much things cost. Exactly. Yeah, and I'll recapitulate from one of our prior podcasts. Mises points out that if you want clean water for an area, you can filter the local water, you can import the water, or you can synthesize water from hydrogen and oxygen. And it is only because we have recourse to a market that we know that the latter is an absolutely preposterous idea. And this is also the example that Hayek gives for how traders create value. And again, because trade or commerce is a thing unseen, it's not like, hey, I produce these cantaloupes, would you like to buy them for me? Because that a lot of the value created through trade involves bringing what he calls trace elements, or very obscure ingredients. Imagine the first people who traded the spice route and they brought turmeric back from India. And I would love to see the faces of the people like, what is this orange thing that it's spicy like ginger, but it looks like a carrot inside? And all these novel combinations are kind of part of it. And to kind of transition us into the rest of Hayek's argument, there was a specific quote I wanted to find. And what Hayek points out is that...
While you're looking for that, one connection I would like to throw out there. At some point in this book, he says, I don't know if this was his writing or he's quoting someone, but he said ethics is essentially about how we divvy up the resources. And again, the perspective given in Saftein's book, drawing from the book, The Ultimate Resource, that time is the most essential resource. It's the most essential bottleneck in obtaining any resource, producing any resource. Hoppe defines ethics as what any one human can do to any other human in any given place or time. And so there's this strange... Ethics seems to be this kind of union between like, how do we actually allocate our time towards producing resources? And how do we at the same time create ethical boundaries, right? It's like, what is acceptable or justified for you to do to me or me to do to you? And again, in establishing that boundary properly, which I would argue is private property or several property, you unlock actually more resources. So it was just occurring to me that all these different definitions of ethics seem to have a common point in human time, and that it's how you can spend it, and if you spend it properly, it can unlock a lot more product per unit of human time input.
Yeah, and it reminds me of how the rationalist fallacy evolves or arises, and it's a false dichotomy because Mises calls it, I think, the anarchy of production. People have this tendency to say is like, well, if we don't have central planning, what's the alternative? Chaos. And there's a few interesting observations I want to make there. So the opposite of central planning is not no planning, it's distributed planning.
Mm-hmm.
And the central point in many of Hayek's works is that this distributed form of planning takes into account more information and generates more wealth for more individuals than the alternative. But the other part is that the resources, the excess resources that are created by this process that we call the extended order, have the effect of creating more rules.
Mm-hmm.
So I want think about that for a second. So instead of needing more top-down control, we need more cultural rules that individuals can follow. Because that is exactly what is implied, is that in order for other groups to distinguish themselves through this process of evolution and survival, they would need more rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, this is the ways in which our minds deceive us, is that we think liberty means less laws on the books, and it does, but it means more laws in the heart and more laws in the head.
Right, right.
And so, and this is one of those, I keep going back to things seen and things unseen. And this is from Bastiat, you know, the great French economic, probably my favorite and the clearest single book on economics. And he says, well, if somebody shatters a window, does that create more work for the glass workers? Yes, but it's ultimately not creation, because that capital had alternative uses, which what you were just saying about human time. Is that there's all these rich alternatives for human time, but we can only discover those alternatives, A, with population density, B, with an intense division of labor, and C, with these rules. And, you know, here's the other thing. Hayek is order without organizations. Just because he's saying that he doesn't want governments to interfere, and I'll read the quote about money in just a second, doesn't mean we won't have organizations. They'll just be through voluntary association. And this touches on Eleanor Ostrom's work as well. And people mistakenly think that she's very pro-libertarian in her thinking. And what she shows is that, first of all, the tragedy of the commons is one of these Aristotelian fears. Not that Aristotle evolved it, but it's one of these irrational fears that, oh no, some people are going to take more and they're going to abuse the commons. And what Ostrom showed is that what she calls CPRs, common pooled resources, like fisheries, guess what? If people evolve a set of rules for governing the commons, you can totally have a shared fishery, and you don't in any way need or want the government coming in to interfere with what people can and cannot do with, this is important, the resources that their own livelihoods depend upon. And this is why Mises says that entrepreneurs cannot be trained. We as individuals, every single individual is an entrepreneur in their own life. We risk our own destiny. It is only in the process of risking your destiny and putting your skin in the game that you can even pretend to possibly make good decisions. And this is why it's so offensive that a central planner would come and say, oh, this thing is not now forbidden. It is now forbidden to own this class of object. It is now forbidden to set the interest rate. And, you know, I have to admit, even Trump is guilty of this now. He's saying, we're going to cap credit card interest rates at 10%. Anyway, that is why it is so offensive and destructive to the natural order for a central planner, or what we would call a coercive planner, to come in and say, hey, these are now the rules, because the process of evolution is totally open-ended, and we cannot hope to plan a process based on a future that is unknown. So, and this is what Hayek says about money, and maybe we can roll that on to a few more themes in the book. He says, the history of government management of money has, except for a few short happy periods, been one of incessant fraud and deception. In this respect, governments have proved far more immoral than any private agency supplying distinct kinds of money in competition possibly could have been. I have suggested elsewhere, and I will not argue again here, that the market economy might well be better able to develop its potentialities if government monopoly of money were abolished. And we're finally seeing that through technology. And here's the thing. This was a passion project. Did Satoshi, maybe he hoped it would be $1 trillion market capitalization product? He was just a dude who had an interest in cryptography and privacy. And guess what? He's the product of his parents. And cryptography came from a branch of math called number theory. And number theory was nothing but fooling around with integers for decades, for hundreds of years, for centuries. What if a central planner were to come in, you know, and in this book, Hayek points out that even great minds such as Einstein fell under the spell of socialism. And Einstein is famous for saying production for use, not for profit. But what if I said mathematics for use, not for profit? When then I would say, well, everybody should now become a state economist and should calculate this, that, and the other. No,
the very foundation of the one thing that is giving us freedom from state money was a bunch of mathematicians fooling around for 300 years. That became cryptography and network security and encryption and SHA-256 and all these ECDSA and all these primitives that Satoshi used. But they wouldn't exist if people didn't have the freedom to fool around and do things that they were interested in. And this is the critical thing. It didn't appear in their generation. The greatest mathematician of all time, Gauss, he said, it is safe to assume number theory was known as the queen of mathematics, that number theory will never have any practical applications. But here it is. That's how you build encryption. So all of that to say, it's the freedom of the individual to explore over many lifetimes a new set of rules, a new set of interests that for a totally unknown future. I mean, think of how unknown the future of the dinosaurs were. And we may not be much different. People will be able to try diverse strategies. It's the true meaning of diversity. People actually being free to do different things, fundamentally different things. Yeah. And, you know, in the work of Soul, we see this was, to take one example, this is how the Armenians rose out of poverty. They had this expertise in cloth trading, and they were interested in textiles. And to this day, they are dominant in that industry. Or the Scotsmen. Like, again, it was said there was before Hume's time, about 200 years before, there wasn't a Scottish nobleman who knew how to write his own name. But then they produced Hume and the great mind in this book. So yeah, maybe you can help me tie that point up about how it's about the adventure of the spirit, and you don't need a reason for why you want to study number theory or why you're going to leave a mailing list when Gavin Andreessen is like, I'm going to present to the CIA. You don't need a reason for these things, but they end up being very important later. And had it been purely a product of reason, would these people have done anything? I mean, mathematics does use the ratiocinative the faculty, but what to explore and when to explore it should be up to the individual.
Yeah, and the freedom, the leisure that capitalism buys you or affords you, I guess you would say, is what gave those people the freedom, the actual freedom of time to explore number theory for hundreds of years, right? Without having to spend every waking moment trying to feed or shelter themselves. So it's that leisure that gets invested wherever people's interests lie that can bear fruit that you would never foresee, right? Like you even said, Gauss, the greatest mathematician, said number theory would be useless. Well, now it's given us the most practical technology there's ever been, perhaps. Yep. And the point on profit too, this is another one that just blows my mind. Like, we still are demonizing profit, the profit motive, and like these politicians that are attacking it, it's so fucking hypocritical, right? That they are in office in pursuit of their own profit motive. It's practically become an inside joke now, the Nancy Pelosi thing, right? Where her salary is a few $100,000 a year, but her net worth has gone up $75 million.
She's the greatest stock trader of all time.
Exactly. And it's like, how can you, like, somewhere in the book, he describes the profit motive as something like the only signal that tells you when the amount of satisfactions that come out of it are greater than the effort that went into it, something like that. Like, it's an actual signal of progress. There is no other signal of progress, right? If it's a profitable thing, that means that people want it more than the inputs going into it, right? That you're creating more human satisfaction than the sacrifice necessary to produce it, something like that. And if the profit margin's large enough, well, then it draws in a lot more producers to do the same thing.
Yep.
Right. And then until it becomes commoditized and the profit margins are thin, and then we've solved that problem in a very efficient way, we can take our attention and allocate it towards solving larger and more complicated problems. And like this iterative layering process driven by the profit motive is actually how we build civilization. So it's like, I can't believe we're in 2024 and people are still demonizing this thing. Like it's like demonizing words or demonizing math. Like any of these signaling technologies that are essential to human cooperation, it just makes no sense.
Well, this is part of this broken intellectual heritage that we all have, right? And learned through school. And then this section from Hayek is called The Condemnation of Profit and the Contempt for Trade. So the condemnation of profit comes from, and in the Bible we have warnings against usury, unusually high interest rates, and the request for honest weights and measures. And this is, again, part of the mysticism that, well, And this is the feeling that people have for Wall Street. Well, these people don't produce anything. The Occupy Wall Street movement, okay? And I think what we need to do, instead of saying, is understand what those people might be thinking, okay? And the first thing that this is again part of going all the way back to Greco-Roman times, the contempt for trade, and who's this foreigner going to foreign lands and not producing anything but presuming to connect person A with person B and then make a profit in the trade. And I want to read a few important passages from Hayek here. So he first notes that disdain for profit disdains progress. So in this world in which we do not know one another, and that's the world we all want to live in, because one can argue that maybe ultimately for our happiness we don't want iPhones and these kinds of things, but without a large planet, without large profits, the iPhones of the world are impossible. And it is then preposterous and hypocritical for government to say, as Kamala Harris has said, and Trump has his own failings, we will take away your patent. She's on tape saying this. We will come and steal your patent if it's for the good of the people, right? That fails to take into consideration that destroys an environment where anybody would even try to make something that hard. Why would somebody, if SpaceX couldn't ever be profitable, why would Elon Musk even try to get someone to Mars?
Sure.
If intellectual property, and this will be very controversial, couldn't be protected, nobody would even try to discover certain drugs. Okay. So again, disdain for profit disdains progress. Why? Because profit is not something extra. It's just in this game we play where we don't know one another, but want to cooperate and help one another across the game, where extra money is appearing is a signal.
Yeah.
Just as in the boom and bust cycle that Mises talks about, in the business cycle that Mises talks about, there are signals like the interest rate that can be either false or correct, that cause entrepreneurs to overestimate or underestimate the profitability and the viability of the business at a given time. Profit is just a signal that something is working. And guess what? We should be thrilled with this. When there's profit for a new drug, it means that we've found something that millions of people found useful. And again, this is part of the fallacious thinking of Marxism. And here's how Marxism reasons. They say, well, the bourgeois don't actually produce anything. The workers produce everything. But what they don't realize, and Hayek brings this out, is that without the existence of the bourgeois, there's nothing for the proletariat to do, because there's no one directing the capital. There's no one building the factories. And the reason you can go to your job, earn a wage, come home, and I'm sad to say this American dream is dying because of inflation, and put your kids through school and have an apartment or have a place to live. The reason you cannot know what you're doing is because the director of the factory and the market forces tell you what to produce. And you don't have to worry about who's going to use your things. So here's what Hayek says about this. He says, it is hence hard to believe that anyone accurately informed about the market can honestly condemn the search for profit. The disdain of profit is due to ignorance and to an attitude that we may, if we wish, admire in the ascetic who has chosen to be content with the small share of the riches of this world, but which, when actualized in the form of restrictions on profits of others, is selfish to the extent that it imposes asceticism and indeed deprivations on all sorts, on others. And this is again the blind spot of socialism. They're not even willing to expose their philosophy to empirical test. And what I'll flip over to you with, there isn't the basis of Marx's philosophies and socialism as a whole is that the proletariat are suffering because of exploitation by the bourgeois. And yet, there is not a socialist country in the world where the condition of the workers exceeds the condition of the workers in capitalist countries. So to say that the workers are oppressed is a misnomer, because they wouldn't even exist under a centrally planned economy, or they would have no direction. I mean, and again, I guess the last point, there was this this Marxist professor on Twitter was saying, someone asked him a question, is like, well, under socialism, would I get my Xbox? And he said, well, yes, but you would have to convince the other factory managers that this was something worthwhile, and guess you would still get your Xbox. 0% chance, because it's the division of labor and the existence of profit that drives that division of labor and drives people to divide labor, that allows such extravagant things that are so far from subsistence, so far from survival to arise.
It's so irreplaceable. Right? There's no other system to create this level of wealth and progress. Do you want to give your kids a foundation of freedom and understanding of Bitcoin and a healthy skepticism of government? Then you should try Tuttle Twins. It's a cartoon about a grandma with a time-traveling wheelchair who takes her grandkids on hilarious adventures to learn about economics and freedom. Think the education of Magic School Bus meets the comedy of The Simpsons. With Tuttle Twins, your kids can learn about Bitcoin from Satoshi Nakamoto, civil disobedience from Harriet Tubman, natural rights from John Locke, and how to destroy the economy from Karl Marx. Today, Hollywood greenlights a lot of woke content or mindless garbage. Each episode of Tuttle Twins is parent-funded, parent-vetted, and only released when it's parent-approved. Because Tuttle Twins is fan-funded, it was the world's first kids show to teach about Bitcoin. That episode alone has been seen over 40 million times and was tweeted about by Michael Saylor. You can watch episodes of Tuttle Twins for free right now. And if you like what you see, you can use code BREEDLOVE for 10% off a subscription to the Angel Studios app and watch all of the episodes. So go to angel.com/breedlove to discover Tuttle Twins today. And remember to use code BREEDLOVE for 10% off. One of my highest health priorities is keeping my brain in top shape. To take care of my brain power, I do many things, such as striving to read, write, exercise, and meditate daily. One of the latest tools in my brain power toolkit is MindLab Pro. MindLab Pro is a nootropic supplement that is scientifically proven to enhance your brain power. When I take MindLab Pro, my mind feels like it has a better grip on the world, my thinking is more lucid, and the articulation of my speech is radically improved. MindLab Pro has been tested in rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled human trials and has been proven to enhance brain power for users in every age group. MindLab Pro is an advanced formulation of 11 nootropic ingredients and is backed by research from over 1,400 human trials conducted over the past 32 years. So if you're looking to enhance your brain power, MindLab Pro is an excellent solution. Go to mindlabpro.com/breedlove to start enhancing your brain power today. Again, that's mindlabpro.com/breedlove. Before starting the What is Money show, I spent most of my career as a CFO, overseeing internal technology implementations and business acquisitions. Over the next 10 years, it is projected that over 12 million businesses in the US will be sold. If you are an operator running a business generating between $5 and $200 million of revenue, and you're considering selling your business within the next decade, then there is a significant opportunity for you to deploy technology to streamline business processes, reduce operating costs, and enhance the multiple your business ultimately sells for. To this end, I am partnering with the team at Emerge Dynamics, a firm with decades of experience in maximizing the value of privately held small and middle market businesses. Go to emergedynamics.com/breedlove to learn how you can build an attractive, high multiple company that maximizes your return when you fully exit. Again, that's emergedynamics.com/breedlove. The other thing on profit that I think is important is that if you dig deeply enough into it, it's ultimately a psychological phenomenon, right? It's this idea that you are better off than you were. Like when you enter a trade consensually, you would only do so because you believe you're going to be better off after the trade than you are before the trade. And this is the magic of consent, because when both parties do that, both parties profit psychologically with every consensual trade. Now, if you introduce coercion into that equation, well, that means that one of the parties is not willing to do it. And so they suffer psychological loss or psychological break even at best, while another party, obviously the coercing party, would have psychological profit in that exchange. And so you could think, we typically think there's only financial profit, but I think financial profit is really just a mirror or an approximation, a social appraisal of the psychological profit that's building up through consensual trade. And, that's like, isn't that almost the definition of making a better world? It's like you want people to be more satisfied, and so you want the satisfaction to be mutual. You want you want every exchange to be mutual and consensual so that both parties can profit psychologically. And then obviously that becomes encoded as financial profit that actually guides the actions of producers and consumers toward the most urgent wants of consumers in the marketplace, basically.
Well, and this is a good example of things unseen. And now let's dissect one of Trump's policies. And let's say that
what he's proposing is that we cap credit card while the consumer is getting back on their feet. We cap credit card interest rates at 10%.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the effects unseen of something like that. That may, in fact, cause some individuals not to be able to get credit at all.
Mhm.
Because if the interest rate is only 10%, they're going to have to vet the risk
Yeah.
of individuals, and they're going to only have to extend to individuals who are very low risk.
Mhm.
And so it's much like the minimum wage. It has this unseen effect of actually reducing the total amount of credit or capital available.
Yeah.
And I think this again comes from this intelligent design failure, is that we believe, well, there is this profit that arose and we can now take this profit and redistribute it. Well, profit didn't arise, it was earned.
Mhm.
And what you're proposing is the destruction of the rules that led to the behaviors that caused the appearance of that profit,
Yes.
right? So what does that mean? Let's take an example. Let's say, and I do find this disgusting and I have my own reasons for why that is the case. Let's take something like insulin, which is necessary.
Yeah.
It is in large part due to overregulation that no one can manufacture, that more people can't manufacture a $5 vial of insulin. And let's say that you have the belief that, well, drugs should never be expensive and you cap drug industry profits. What you've actually done is destroyed the behaviors and destroyed the desire of entrepreneurs to enter that market and find anything in the first place. And this is what Hayek is critiquing, is that when government constrains behaviors such that individuals cannot think their way out of a situation and cannot adventure their way out of a situation with new options and new optionality, we've destroyed humanity as a whole. One less discoverer, one less drug in the world can have an impact on millions or billions of people, as you see with something like the polio vaccine.
Yeah.
Which is actually an interesting case because I think Salk actually forewent profits on the polio vaccine. But
Yeah, price ceilings creating shortages, basically. So in the case of capped, what was it? You said Trump's proposing capped credit card.
Yeah, that's one of the
rates?
recent
Yeah.
things that he said,
So that would-
just to balance the.
Yeah, that would
Discussion.
create a shortage of credit, basically, right?
Yeah.
And obviously, there's deeper problems here, right? Why do we need so much credit? Well, we're in a fiat currency economy, and blah blah blah. But then the flip is also true, right? You try to create a price floor, like minimum wage is basically a price floor for labor. You end up with surplus, right? You end up with all these surplus laborers standing around with no job that would have otherwise been employed if you remove the institutional barriers and let the market clear, right? Let supply and demand meet wherever that intersection point is. That is the naturally discovered price, and you wouldn't have institutional unemployment, at least. So there's like, you can't, there's no, again, it's funny here. And he says this at the beginning of the book. He's not condemning reason or rationality per se. He's condemning the idea that we can use our reason or rationality to reconstruct the world by force or by central planning in a way that's better than what the emergent or extended order is. So no matter, and this is why, and Mises says this in the book, Human Action, all government action is a misallocation of capital. It's like basically no matter what the government does, it is actually, it's coercing people legally. It's lowering the psychological profit. And when we say misallocation of capital, what does that mean? It's like, well, the proper allocation of capital would be one that's consistent with the wishes of consumers that have done useful work for others, basically, right? It's people that have earned savings and then they're allocating it in a way to buy the things that they want. When government intervenes, they're violating the property rights of those people with savings, basically. They're stealing their purchasing power.
Through inflation,
Through inflation, through taxation, through fiat regulation. And then they're redirecting those proceeds to do other things like go to war and, propagandize and all the things that governments do. So it's really, it paints a really bleak picture for the role of the state in any capacity whatsoever. Like, it's just been this flat out exploitative business model since time immemorial, right? That people figured out, oh, we've got weapons or force, we can bludgeon these people and steal from them, even condition them to believe that we are a normal, regular part of society. But I think it's just the most sophisticated form of gang violence that humans know of. And we're still stuck under its spell, right? We're still well, Kamala needs this and Trump. It's like, why? Why do we need one ape to rule 330 million apes? Like, it just doesn't make any sense.
You know, it's funny though. One of the points that Hayek makes in the book is that every society that has evolved and that has survived evolved a government.
Mm-hmm.
And its job is supposed to be, in the libertarian sense, the protection of several property, the protection of private property.
Yeah.
It then grows to be able to do so many more things. And one of the simplest things we can do is impose market discipline upon the government, which it doesn't have. And Friedman makes this point is that
It's basically what Bitcoin does, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
because it is fundamental scarcity and fundamental allocation. And this point is very important. What you're talking about is capital accumulation. And what the Austrians note is that rising standards of living, increasing wages, technological improvements, that all comes from capital accumulation. But governments never accumulate capital. They only disperse capital. And they disperse it under the false ideal that we have a better way to redistribute. Again, we talked about why that's a fallacy, to distribute this money than an individual could when selfishly acting for themselves. But this is the beautiful thing about the market, is that when you act in your own interests, you actually inadvertently serve others by employing them and exchanging with them. And if the exchange is voluntary, then it can be profitable on both sides. And this is, a hard pill for people to swallow. But again, I hope the outcome of this work can be that people will have not only a sense of awe for how the extended order is constructed and how markets function, but will have sound arguments for liberty. And this is what Hayek says. He says, thus, without the rich, without those who accumulated capital, this is the point. It's not, and again, without profit, there's no capital accumulation. So that whole syllogism falls if there's no profit. Without the rich, without those who accumulated capital, those poor who could exist at all, the things unseen, would be very much poorer indeed, scratching a livelihood from marginal lands on which every drought would kill most of the children they would be trying to raise. The creation of capital altered such conditions more than anything else. As the capitalist became able to employ other people for his own purposes, his ability to feed them served both him and them. And the tragedy of our time then is that we live in a world where people who believe in coercive planning and command economies and who are factually and logically wrong have co-opted capitalism to be some kind of brutal and insensitive philosophy that doesn't provide for people, when just the opposite is true. And the only reason they're able to say that is underneath the profits and protections that a capitalist society has provided. And the only reason the people that they are calling disadvantaged, the only reason the planet can even afford to support them, is because of markets and exchange.
Yeah, it is unreal how socialists trying to saw off the branch on which all of civilization rests, in a way, which is again back to that whole idea of Rousseau trying to frame the savage as like the moral ideal toward which we should strive. It's like, what do you mean? That's completely backwards. All right, we've been going for a bit here. I thought maybe this is it's not a terribly long book, but it's very dense, but maybe we could just name off some of the chapters.
Yeah.
And you could jump into maybe some talking points you thought were pretty apt for those particular chapters. We already kind of hit on between instinct and reason, the origins of liberty, property, and justice. Do you want to say something about this?
I think the simplest thing I would say about two, and I'd like you to continue because I think this will help us develop a logical flow to kind of bring it all together for the audience, is that several property is an evolved practice. That's what I would like to say about that. And then further about justice, he says, the process of evolution is amoral and it can never be just because we don't know the outcomes ahead of time. And we don't know whose local actions are going to affect which remote actors.
Yeah.
So, and to that point, Hayek says that the extended order is the most complex structure in the known universe. So that's, keep going.
Yeah, I think if you consider how complex, we know that the human mind is one of the complex structures in the known universe, but the market is that to the power of 8 billion human minds interconnected, right? Interconnected by language, interconnected by law, interconnected by money, interconnected by markets. So the complexity is many orders of magnitude higher than that of even the individual human's mind. So that's an appreciation I think a lot of people lack, and especially when you consider the central bank's kind of mechanical metaphor, like, oh, we're lowering interest rates to manage the economy, or to, as if the economy is some simple machine that you can pull levers and smash buttons and create outcomes. it definitely leaves people with the impression that the wrong impression, frankly, that the global economic extended order, to use Hayek's term, is it's not even complex, that it's just complicated, right? Machines are complicated. Global weather patterns are complex, right? We can barely predict them a few days in advance, and only in certain places. So that's much more in line with the reality of the extended order, that it's this highly complex, dynamic organism, to use a more apt metaphor, rather than a machine. Chapter 3 is titled The Evolution of the Market, Trade and Civilization. Is there something, a passage maybe you found particularly interesting here, or something you want to say about it?
Yeah, I would just draw again to the attention of the ability and the cultural practice of protecting foreigners, right? For which he mentions again this Greek role, I believe called xenos, right?
Is that where we get xenophobia?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes, for foreigner. Yeah. And this kind of mysterious action of people who trade. I think what is important there is not only that our mainline philosophy and the observation of our naked eyes cause us to mistrust these individuals who do not produce anything, but also that the cultural practices that outranked and overrode, in some sense, the desire to fear foreigners, that's a very much instinctual tribal thing, actually led to trade and the division of labor. So I think this is just an evolved process. And again, throughout history, we gave one example of the Armenian culture. They may have a trade, and until they're able to actually ply that trade in exchange with others, it doesn't actually produce wealth for them or for anyone else.
Chapter 4 is the revolt of instinct and reason.
Yes, I think this is summed up best in that Einstein quote that we mentioned earlier, is that Einstein, even being brilliant in physics and math, desired production for use and not production for process, not production for profit. And I think ultimately what the revolt of instinct and reason constitutes is this idea that as rationalism took hold, and this wasn't important, just that it wasn't the whole picture. As rationalism took hold and failed to account for the emergent, evolutionary, transcendent processes that led to our existence, it led to a whole-scale rejection of things that we didn't understand. And this is Hayek's point, is that we're not going to understand, we cannot understand these received practices. They actually operated at a level that is prior to our reason. And so that is just this, intellectual hangover, again, we've traced it back to Aristotle. That, oh yes, well, if we can't justify it, we probably shouldn't do it. That's not true in any way. And Hayek emphatically says that you owe your very life to these processes.
Which leads straight to chapter 5, which is the Fatal Conceit. Again, I'll use this one paragraph description of that. In essence, the fatal conceit is the overestimation of human intelligence and the belief that society can be engineered through deliberate, rational planning, when in fact, much of what makes society function is the result of spontaneous evolutionary processes. So we've just over-indexed on human intelligence as like being the be-all, end-all. And it's not to say that human intelligence, obviously he's writing an entire book about it, human intelligence can look at these things and try to make sense of them, but they're not products of, it's confusing, right? There are products of human intelligence in the sense that they just emerge through the interaction of all these different human intelligences over time, but it's not the product of human intelligence in the sense that there was one group that hammered out the plan and then imposed it on the whole, right? So it's that subtle difference between, I guess, emergent intelligence and top-down intelligence, that he's basically saying the top-down intelligence doesn't actually have anything to do with markets or money or law or language. It's all emergent. It's all constantly undergoing a process of reciprocal reconstruction between all the individual users that use it. And there is no top-down central planner for any of this.
And importantly, going back, it is an evolved process. And just as you said, there was no single individual who sat down and hammered down the plan. What were there? There were many collective groups of individuals who, over the process of generations, were selected by an invisible but nevertheless very tangible market process. And through time, the behaviors and practices that were correct were revealed.
Yes.
This is very, very different.
Yeah.
And the sense in which, the positive sense in which we can use constructivism is we can go back. We can look backwards and say, was hand washing and honesty and honest weights and measures something that led to the rise of this civilization and the fall of this other one? And it's interesting because both Hayek and Sowell give the example of China. And I think Sowell gives the example, they had 9 oil wells at a time when Europe was in the dark ages, but it was government overreach. It was their fear of the barbaric outer world and their desire to interfere and say, well, we should have not trade. Let's close China's borders. And what caused Europe, just as Europe was pulling out of the dark ages, they were doing that because they essentially had something like anarchy where individuals were free to try different things. And it isn't that anarchy itself is profitable or desirable. It's that in a world where individuals have to find their own future and the rules of their success must evolve, you have a very good chance of a successful strategy emerging that the rest of the people can then copy. And that is exactly what Europe did for the rest of the world. And it isn't because there's nothing Eurocentric about that. I just gave an example of where China was far ahead of the Europeans.
Yes.
They just happened through certain quirks of fate and central planning to make decisions that led to the decline of their civilization. While Europe, the little bit of free experimentation that it allowed for, caused them to evolve a set of rules that we really know, as British common law and as the forces of civilization. And, this is the part that I feel most passionate about. We want more civilization. We need more civilization.
Of course.
And we don't need people telling the lie that they, as governments, as central planners, somehow have some special information that they can decide what the outcome should be. And this is the point and the lesson of history is that nobody knows. This is an equation with trillions of variables. Everybody's predictions are going to be wrong.
Yeah.
And this is now fascinating. This adventitious, here's what they decry. They say, well, now there's an unequal distribution of things. This is a necessity, and it's the only way things can happen. And here's why. Not only because profit is the only objective signal as to what is working that can coordinate at the level of the extended order, but because you don't know ahead of time which strategy is going to be successful.
Yes.
So if the people who happen to employ the successful strategy that leads to a future that causes humanity to survive don't profit from it, and you don't allow them to profit from it, we have stopped the process of evolution. And we have stopped the process of progress. And we have stopped civilization as we know it. And I'll just read quickly. So what Hayek says, so far as we know, the extended order is probably the most complex structure in the universe, a structure in which biological organisms that already highly complex have acquired the capacity to learn to assimilate parts of suprapersonal traditions, enabling them to adapt themselves from moment to moment into an ever-changing structure possessing an order of a still higher level of complexity. And what Hayek makes the observation that in biology, we have this distinction between ontogeny and phylogeny. Ontogeny is the development of the individual. Phylogeny is the development of the species. And the thing unseen that he's showing us in this book is the phylogeny of civilization. And central planners say, well, I want the fate of this individual to be different. The problem is that what you want and what you think is a shadow of what actually happened. And you have no power to bend reality and say that this individual should have this outcome. The best you can do, again, is create conditions where individuals have the freedom to explore, to find profit, to find the division of labor, and to find our way into the future. And there's something very beautiful about that because we are all living in the darkness of the mind. And it is only through our ability to imitate one another and trade with one another that we can face an uncertain future. And I have to say, with the interconnection and the poor political choices that we have today, we need this more than ever. I desperately feel a need globally for more civilization. And the surprise is all we need to do is give each other enough freedom to trade with one another and find a new set of rules and a new set of discoveries that will create more wealth so that we can continue to trade and prosper. And to the extent that we misallocate and say, no, all of this money needs to go to bombs for Ukraine, and all of this money needs to go to combating the Russian plague, well, we're not allowing the market process to decide what the outcome will be, and we're stopping progress. And this is, again, why the Austrian point that socialism is a regressive philosophy, not only because it idolizes instinct and childish impulses, which are restrained by morality.
Yeah.
But Hayek makes this point. He's like, philosophies that were anti-family and anti-profit were not successful. And guess what? You just described communism, an anti-family, anti-profit philosophy. It hasn't been successful in practice. And now I'm beginning to see we're in the stage of evolution where we can look at history enough to see that communism and socialism are on a spectrum of command economies and outright reject the process of a command economy because it doesn't produce justice or equality for anybody.
Yeah.
Because the future and the circumstances and the means are totally unknown. And that's the only way that we can continue to make use of scarce resources.
Yeah, no, it's brilliantly said. And then again, it all boils down to private property for me. It's like, just give people a very strong institution of private property and preserve that, and then watch the self-organization create the optimal result, basically. Maybe the good framing for this is like civilization itself is this discovery process guided by the profit motive. And so what we're saying is the more people you can get engaged in that discovery process, well, surprise, surprise, the more likely discoveries become possible, right? Like you're going to have more discoveries the more people we have
and
involved in the
profit and
search.
population. And one, just to interject, one thing I'll add to that, it's not just the discovery process, which is absolutely essential. It is the stability of the received rules.
Yes.
And your first 20 years of life is receiving an operating system for existence. And this is what you were saying earlier, is like, as we have more abstractions that we can lean on, we can specialize individually more. We can focus on individual wealth creation more. But so what I want to say, it isn't just, it's not this scary world where, oh, we all have to become super capitalists and accumulate. That's not the point. The point is that we're living in a world where groups are competing for survival, and it won't be known for another 50 or 100 years which practices lead to survival. So what we need to effectively do is receive the traditions of our ancestors. This doesn't mean religion, and practices of our ancestors. And now, because of the beauty of something like the internet, we have the capacity to observe more individuals than we ever have before. And I think there's a great cultural acceleration. So sorry, that interjection was just to say that it isn't just, hey, we're exploring and oh my God, nobody knows what the future is. It's no, this is the tried and true practices that have led to civilization for 5,000 years. And like, you know, let's not reinvent the wheel, folks. Let's use the wheel and build more exciting, economically speaking, things.
Because those rules have to be discovered as well, right? They're part of the fruit of the discovery process. But then you're right, it's not just enough to discover them. They now need to be transmitted culturally across generations. And there does seem to be a direct. This is a causative relationship as far as I can tell, right? The stability of those rules. And I guess you would also say the transmittability. Like as long as they're stable and transmissible, then you're going to have more innovation, more prosperity, more economic abundance, essentially. And so I wonder, what does this say about Bitcoin, right? I mean, this is like, it's not like Bitcoin's this new thing even. It's like, it's just the best set of rules we've found so far. Yeah. Like it's the most transmissible and unshakable rule set humans have yet discovered. Invented, evolved. Yeah.
Bitcoin is a force of nature too. And actually, this is a great point to all of Hayek's arguments. Bitcoin is a complex system. Like you ever look at hash rate? No, but nobody knows. Like, I mean, there's a trend line. Sometimes it's going up, it's going down. Like look at how full the blocks are. It is a force of nature. And I think what we're seeing is that the dynamics of a complex system, number one, and the evolution of rules. Bitcoin is a rule-based system, but the culture is not quite transmitted by individuals. It's transmitted by nodes.
Yeah.
And I don't know, this is just like, it's one of those inflection points in evolution where we have machines.
It is also individuals though. It's also like,
yes, because you have to choose
to hold
like which side of the fork you want to be on.
Sure.
Is that what you mean?
Well, yeah. Choosing which node software to run, but also choosing to hold Bitcoin in the first place, right?
As opposed to, you know, any other coin.
Well, holding your savings in whatever USD. Like there's a mimetic component as well as a machine component, and this is where man and machine sort of get wired together in the Bitcoin network.
And to your process about abstraction, and I think abstraction is a good
way to think about the division of labor, right? Because we can abstract away services like farming and manufacturing, we're able to focus on the things that we're good at. That this layer of money is now abstracted and autonomous in a way. It's like, can you take your complaint to the CEO of Bitcoin? No, right? Can you like stamp out one country and hope to have destroyed it? No. And culture and humans have this. I hate to use this word, but I don't use it in a pejorative sense. This cockroach-like capacity that we're just really hard to kill.
Survivability.
And this is the nature of culture and and these things. And can you imagine if that were subject to the whims of reason? Okay, this is a great example actually, because I think Ethereum wants to be, well, hey, here's all these sexy cryptographic ideas, and here are these ideas that Bitcoin had, but we can do better.
Right.
They are very much like, they have shiny object syndrome, but they very much are like central planners.
Yeah.
But the market refuses to bend the knee.
Yeah.
Right.
Bitcoin is the capitalism, what Ethereum is the socialism.
Something like this. Something like this. Or they're the Keynesians and and we're the Austrians, or something like that. But yeah, I think ultimately what it has to say is that rule-based systems that are decentralized rules cause systems to flourish.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this is another gear. That's it, Robert. This is the thing which I've been trying so hard to say. And I read this book 3 times, and I will read it a 4th, and I'm sure I will find new things. But the thing I've been striving to say is that we have the capacity to evolve and not plan new sets of rules. And we should feel simultaneously a sense of awe to preserve the market order. And wow, the market is actually action at a distance, and an individual working in a factory can feed his own family and help people around the world, and build a single part that goes into a plane that transports a certain person across the ocean. But let's create the conditions under which new voluntary rules of association can evolve, and that's going to lead to the survival of our species. And that's why, to this point, so you were at the Fatal Conceit, so our poisoned language. That's why terms are so important. And there's a quote in here from Confucius. I'll definitely get it wrong, but it basically says, when a civilization loses its language, it loses its civilization.
Sure.
Because that is the foundation. And so this is a great example, and that is what fiat is. Fiat is like, well, how much is $1 worth? Well, it's a 20th of an ounce of gold. Well, how much is $1 worth? Well, right? So you get to make up, and this is so cool.
It's an impaired language.
What's that?
It's an impaired language.
Yeah, and it's just a stretchable. It's like if I had a ruler and I can change the length of it, it's not very helpful.
If I have a word and I can change the meaning of it, it's not very helpful.
Precisely. Yeah. And I don't know. I think this is the demonstration of the future. We have this entity that's not quite alive, but it is distributed. It's very hard to kill, and everything about it is based on rules. And this is it. Let me give you a jumping point there. The definition, the informal definition of a hard fork, of a soft fork, let me say, is one that changes the rules in a backwards compatible way. This is like Hayek saying okay, let's evolve our future traditions based on present. Whereas a hard fork is like, no, you're backwards incompatible.
Exactly.
We're going to change the block. I don't know. There's something.
It reminds me of the legal discovery process versus legislation by fiat, right? Where English common law is sort of observing how we've been settling disputes over time and then codifying what dispute resolution processes work as law. Whereas fiat legislation is more like a guy is in power and he just says, this is the law. And he signs the thing, says, do this or else, That's like a hard fork. You're kind of throwing out whatever we discovered in the past. No, it doesn't matter anymore. Here's what you're going to do now. Whereas a soft fork is this accretive process. Like you're maintaining the stability of tradition and custom and norms and all the things that you've learned through, trial and error and disputes up until that point. Every increment to the law is a soft fork. It's backwards compatible in common law, and it's the opposite in fiat legislation world.
And it overcomes, a lot of the socialism hangover and infatuation with socialism is this fear that we'll have chaos if we don't have central planners and a strong leader. And this goes back so far, right? Or this longing. This is
the confusing the layers again because of the Dunbar's number level. Like you kind of want the strong leader guy
in a family,
yeah, or even in a family. But for the 330 million Americans, it's like, I don't know that you actually need that.
And that's to answer your question. Bitcoin is showing us that we can have rule-based systems that don't quite have a head, but never tick-tock next block. Every 10 minutes, roughly every 10 minutes, a new block is created, And it's this is the crazy thing. It's an island of stability. And I guess
what we communicate to people is not only a sense of awe for how they live in a world where people can become richer and richer through the division of labor, where there can be more and more people through the division of labor, where there can be action and compassion at a distance, at a great distance, at the scale of billions of people through the market process. Not only a sense of awe for that, but a sense of peace. And this is a very strange thing to say. And I don't say it in a theistic way. That's a separate, totally separate podcast, totally separate discussion.
Yeah.
I don't say it in a theistic way, is that we can learn to trust the market process. And there's a great thinker, Wilhelm Reich, who was, I guess, one of Freud's students. Okay. And he basically said that at some point in the course of evolution, this was for a totally different subject. It was actually for sexual function that he developed this theory. But he said, man ceased to trust his own instincts. And it is very significant that the moral faculty is between instinct and reason and restrains instinct. But it's something that we can learn to trust.
Yeah.
And we can learn to trust the stability of being able to trade with other individuals.
Yes.
And now the only thing, if we can't have borders, and this is a major problem, and it's something that I think the borders that we need, this is it, are cultural borders. We need cultural borders. And that's what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is a domain of practice which says, if you wish to play, you must play by these rules.
Yes.
And that's what we're learning. We're learning that we can have a sense of awe for these complex systems that are evolved, not planned, and that our way to participate in them is through creating the conditions where exchange can take place.
Yeah. Opt-in obedience in a way, right?
And that will become, I pray, the operating system of the young generation, because the desire for communism, the desire for equality is also, it does also appeal to human instincts. But this human animal, and maybe we can show the Starlings and have a discussion about that.
For sure.
We have this capacity to flock and to create emergent behaviors together. And it only manifests in the form of global prosperity, which is exactly what we need to check war and special interests.
Yes. You were saying you don't want to say it in a theistic way, but I couldn't help but notice you're basically saying be fruitful and multiply. Capitalism is the means by which we become fruitful and multiply.
This process which has worked for our ancestors.
Yes, there's an element of faith.
And to participate in this process and to understand that the only reason we can have this, and this just kills me every single time, and I can't make this point enough times, and neither can Hayek, we can only have this conversation in the context of the dregs of capitalism that are left over from, the first 200 or 300 years of America, because that's the only world in which we have enough division of labor, we have incentive, we have adventitious and exploration for individuals to find things, and we can create property and we can have possessions, we can have this discussion. There's an internet on which we can transmit. And there's lots of interesting things to think there. And maybe we can talk about the role the government played in the creation of the internet. But I would love to show the flock of starlings.
Yeah, the murmuration of starlings. Okay. That's it right there, right?
Yeah.
Order without any head bird.
Yeah, so what we're watching is something called a murmuration, or a flock of starlings. And this is a great example of a structure that is not planned, is not necessarily predictable, but emerges from the individuals following very simple rules. And you can show, actually, in a computer simulation, there are only something like 4 rules: alignment, avoiding, crowding, cohesion. Actually, you can do it with just 3 rules, but I think now they're called BOIDs, BOIDS. A guy named Craig Reynolds developed these. I had the chance of working with Craig in one of my prior jobs. But the key point here is that you have this very simple rule-based system. There's no central authority, and it's not even clear what the evolutionary advantage. Why does this happen? And why was it the case that starlings that are able to murmurate were the ones that survived and are the ones that now persist on planet Earth? And none of this matters. What matters is that a complex whole can evolve without the intention of any central planner, through simply individuals following very simple rules that are not the result of their rational mind. These birds aren't thinking; they would be on the ground dead if they were trying to drive a car over email, sort of thing. And the other point, and this is again just a metaphor, and it's a metaphor for these things unseen. It's a metaphor for this moral layer that restrains our instinct and generates the extended order. No 2 murmurations are alike. But show anyone any murmuration, and they'll be able to call it what it is. And this is Yes, and it's this nature. It's something which is recognizable, but is nevertheless not constant and not known ahead of time. And I feel civilization. That's my point. Is civilization is that way. We know civilization when we're part of it. It's the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that keeps us above a very demeaning and mean existence of subsistence. And so I guess this is, again, for me, this is one way I feel the awe. And I encourage people to watch it and turn on the audio as well. Because
and obviously it's beautiful to watch, which like it's hard to observe the extended order in action because it's, well, by definition, all over the place. I would say that essay you brought up earlier, I Pencil, is one of the most poetic descriptions of it I've ever read. Very beautiful language. But again, to your point, these birds are just individually following very simple rules, right?
That's right.
Keep each bird about 2 feet from my left wing and my right wing and do what the guy in front of me does, something like that.
Yep.
And you get this, it
Without
starts to look like
crashing.
one organism, basically.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And that's what we are becoming in the market economy, right? We go from the individual to the extended order or organism.
We're following very simple rules like several property, like honesty, like savings. And these murmurations are recorded up to 1 million birds or more. Okay. So if a literal bird brain can coordinate itself, this is the intuition for how and why we can trust a market process, which on its surface seems extremely selfish, but nevertheless is the only process. The whole idea of the invisible hand, and this scares a lot of people. And this goes back to this mistrust of mysticism and this mistrust of trade and this mistrust of people who don't produce. But the whole point of the invisible hand, and again, there's no perfect word for this. This is why Hayek is always inventing new words. Well, it's the extended order, it's Cadillacs, it's all these different things. Is that the whole that emerges is the result of simple rules applied by the individuals. And those individuals participate in a whole that's larger than themselves without having any knowledge of the flock as a whole. A single starling in this murmuration can probably see 5 other birds, 6 other birds. And that local coordination multiplied by the entire flock causes this global coordination. That's right. So it's local coordination leading to global coordination.
There you go. Local coordination leading to global. And for us, it's, classical biblical ethics, right? Don't lie, cheat, steal, or kill. And we get this highly complex, prosperous order from which we all benefit. We all benefit from the division of labor, right? Like, I don't know how to create any of this stuff or a couch or Topo Chico water, but we just benefit from the fruits of it constantly. But because it's all, it's always available, I guess it's taken for granted in the modern age. And so thank God for these libertarian thinkers getting us to think about it more deeply.
Maybe we can now, as we start to close out, we can review the Hayek's order of argumentation. So we finish the chapter order, and maybe I'll find something where Hayek can take us out.
Okay, cool. So the next chapter was Religion and the Guardians of Tradition. I didn't actually read that particular chapter, but I wonder if it does have to do with imitation and prohibitions, right? That we had in religious orders early on. These things became kind of the groundwork or the substrate on which we built other social institutions.
Yeah. Well, here's the most interesting thing. I used to formerly say that what Hayek means by morality includes things like religion and intuition, and I think that was a misunderstanding. And what Hayek points out, and it's fascinating because there's a moment in this chapter where he interjects, well, I happen to be an atheist, or more like an agnostic. He's like, I don't understand what people mean by the word God. And it is much like the word, people use the word society and don't understand the whole to which they're referring. His point was that religion was an aegis or a guardian of the behaviors that were part of the evolutionary success or failure of certain groups. So religion basically is a guise under which behaviors can be transmitted. Okay, so as an example, let's say that honest weights and measures, savings, that's honesty. Right? And what do they say? Like no lying, no cheating, no stealing.
Yeah,
right? Like
thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal.
Religion then embellishes and say you will go to hell and you will suffer an eternal lake of fire. I mean, these may well be real. That's not the subject of this podcast.
Well, civilization definitely goes there if everyone engages in it, right? Like you want to see hell on earth,
Facts.
just tell everyone kill, everyone steal. Like,
Oh,
hell
you're
on
seeing,
earth
I
in 2
mean,
seconds.
flip on the news.
Yeah.
Look at, and this is actually, if America is the most capitalist nation in the world, and we're in the massive throes of socialism right now. And if you need any proof of that, the 50% of GDP higher, I think, starting in the COVID area, government spending is 50% of GDP. I mean, this is pushing 50%. I think we're at 40%, something like that. The number is constantly fluctuating. The key point there is that nobody works desperately to escape capitalism. It's always socialism and central planning that they're escaping.
Right. Yeah.
And what is hell? It is a form of selfishness and a dearth, a lack of things. And this is exactly, and having to eke out a miserable existence, which is the only alternative that socialism has to offer to the market economy.
Yeah, and an untruth. Socialism is a lie, right? It's
talk more about that.
Well, what is from each according to their ability to each according to their need, right? We can have this communist utopia, which socialism is an offshoot or a junior descendant of. That's fundamentally untrue. You can't organize humans under this philosophy of from each according to their ability to each according to their need. Like, well, whose ability? Who's going to incentivize them to use their ability? Who's deciding who has what needs, right? To what extent are these needs possible? You can't actually organize a large group of humans under that. So it's,
that's right.
I was just saying that capitalism, what does Safety say? He goes, capitalism is what happens when you leave people alone. It is the self-organizational, normal kind of state of being. It's when people, again, the rational mind overrides the emergent or evolved order and says, oh, no, these things are wrong. We need a central bank. We need a 3-letter agency. We need whatever the override is.
Yeah.
And all of that is just fundamentally untrue as far as I can tell.
And I'll add risk to myself a little bit to what Safety had said. Capitalism, what happens when you leave people alone under evolutionarily stable, evolved rule sets, right?
Yeah.
So this received rule set. And if you think about the difficulty in planning what Hayek calls the most complex, if it can be called an organism, the most complex structure in existence, it must be the case that no individual brain can conceive, no collection of brains can conceive of what is actually happening in that totality. And also that the first time we try it, we will get it wrong.
Yeah.
So all we have, the only just system we can hope for are rules that allow for individual autonomy and allow us the chance to discover what might be a better future.
Yes.
So and the received rules are all important, is what I'm saying there.
Yeah.
And isn't it beautiful that a lot of those received rules are ethical observations, not stealing, respecting the boundaries of other people. Right. And this is a big part. And it's amazing that that's neither instinctual nor rational, this force that restrains us because it's an invisible force. And yet it has this formative effect on the planet.
I think it's so interesting that, Hayek doesn't know what God means, but it's like, well, what does the invisible hand mean? It's interesting that we anthropomorphize, again, both of these things. And I don't know, I wonder if there's a relation between the Smithian invisible hand and God, right? If there's just another perspective on it, that maybe God is this interconnective force that causes all this self-organization and creativity.
Yeah.
Like maybe we just can't find a word for it. It's the source of all creation, the creator even. Maybe we just use that word as a indexing to that principle that is very difficult to put into words.
Well, and I think that is the fundamental problem. So for me, the market process, how do I explain this? The market process is totally impersonal and totally amoral, and it works for you whether you believe in God or not. I think that's the most important thing to state.
Yeah, but there's a moral presupposition built into it for it to work, right? Because private property has a moral dimension.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's critical. Yes, there are moral underpinnings that allow you to participate. And this is actually really interesting. So Richard Dawkins was recently quoted as saying that, well, culturally, I'm Christian. I like to go see nice churches, right?
Sure.
And this is kind of highlighting this tension between the rational and the moral minds. But what I wanted to say there is that what it had, this is it. It's the awe for complexity. You see, it's both the awe and the trust.
Awe for complexity and trust. Yeah. Okay.
And so, and then that is the part that in our hyper rational society
Yeah.
that we find so difficult to fit. And like, well, how can this work? How can this possibly work? And all we can point to and say is that it does work. And I guess if you want to extrapolate that a little bit and make something spiritual or mystical about it, I think
Well,
love.
let's before you don't go spiritual and mystical.
Yeah.
Sorry, just to throw one thing in there. It's interesting that you selected the word awe of complexity.
Yeah.
Because awe is that which inspires imitation. So it's like if we have this awe for complexity in the world, and then we somehow, that's how we create more complexity, right? This capitalism is, well, we're creating a wider variety and a wider quantity of goods and services. We have a more complex productive output. So anyways, there's something about this, but there's something between, again, it's between instinct and reason, right? That how did we transmit all this culturally relevant information to become a more complex, fruitful and multiplying species? And I think it has a lot to do with imitation. I think even those starlings they're largely imitating one another, right? How do they learn those rules?
That's right. And you're trusting that the guy in front of you is not going to crash straight into the ground. Right?
Exactly.
Well, and then this is the beautiful thing. And this is how selfish actions and selfish ends can lead to abundance and prosperity for the whole, is that you know you're not going to crash because you know the guy in front of you doesn't want to.
Right.
I mean, there are exceptions to these rules.
Sure.
Doesn't himself want
At the edges.
And what you helped me see, I would like to give it back to you and for you to explain a little bit about awe is that which inspires imitation. But we are expanding the menu of optionality for human behavior. And that's the only chance. That is my appeal to the listeners and to people who are considering which economic and political systems might be ideal for us, is to create conditions where the optionality to explore. We don't know, like human being, this is another one of those, I can't call it a weasel world, but it's extremely broad. And isn't it neat? First of all, I think, Instagram imitation seems like a terrible idea to me, and I'm sure it's causing a lot of distress and alienation in young people. But the capacity of a thing like the internet to give you a menu of somewhere between 1 million and 8 billion options for how to behave is amazing.
Yeah.
And that's how we're going to plot our course forward, because it does seem to me right now I have a lot of political and economic worries. The only way, we're going to have to invent our way out of it, but that's not going to be purely rational invention. It's going to be an act. People are just going to have convictions, and people are going to have practices and communities of practice and isolated network states that do different things. And we're going to see that worked.
Yeah.
And then I guess in awe, we will. What made you make that connection?
Well, I mean, this is secondhand from Jordan Peterson lectures, but he describes. Have you ever heard someone give like a very moving speech, right? That makes the hair stand up on your arms or whatever. That's a biological signal of awe. Actually, it's piloerection is what they call it. And so like you're in awe of this person and their moving speech, and you're more likely to imitate that person, right? Whatever words they use that gave you that emotional sensation. And so, there's just a connection between awe, but it's not doesn't just have to be people even. The awe for complexity, as you said, complexity is obviously non-human, but I was just curious if that awe for complexity, which I've never heard that term used before, somehow inspires us to imitate our own creative potential, because it does seem in capitalism is where we maximize our creative potential, right? It's like each person specializes in whatever the thing they're interested in to the max, and then everyone else does the same thing, and we all share in the fruits of one another's labor and discoveries, and it's accretive over time. So anyway, there's another thing, I mean, to get off the mystical deep end, if you read the book Human Action, and everywhere you see the word market, just swap in the word God instead. You get a lot of very interesting sentences.
Oh yeah.
Like the market because what is God supposed to be? Omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent, right? So all powerful, all knowing, and everywhere at the same time. Well, what is the market? Well, it's everywhere, all the time. It's the most all-knowing thing we know of, right? It's got the most knowledge flowing through it of anything else. That's why the market, the market can stay, what is it? market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent.
Yeah.
And as far as I can tell, it's one of the most powerful things, probably the most powerful thing human beings create in terms of what it can do. So I'm not saying that God equals market, but I am saying that maybe humans have just struggled with their language to describe these self-organizing dynamics over time. And maybe sometimes we just use a word to represent those things which we find to be beyond words.
Yeah, I think market is a placeholder for something we don't and cannot understand.
Yeah.
And it is, and actually this is really important though. The Austrians are very careful to say that they don't believe that the market is infallible. Because it's a series of processes.
Yeah.
And in an evolutionary process, there may be 100 mutations, so to speak. And Hayek actually makes this parallel, of which there may be millions of mutations, of which one will be successful.
Exactly.
But I think this is what we see when words, this is the limits of our language, which the Austrians and Hayek in particular struggled a lot with.
Yeah.
And he's like, we received all these language. And he's like, by the time we understand a word, we have 1,000 years of practice in using it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And that's why, which is really interesting. He himself, again, what I would call by his own admission in the final chapter, an agnostic or an atheist, he himself says transcendence is the best word to describe the market process because it's just, and here's the thing which goes to the economic calculation problem, which was of course, this is interesting because the Fatal Conceit is Hayek's contribution for the impossibility of socialism. And it's, it's again, the idea that we're coming from this false frame that everything which is ordered had to be planned. The economic calculation problem says, on the other hand, that only a market process can elevate subjective ordinal preferences into objective cardinal prices, right? Because in
changes dimension.
Yes, it changed and it qualitatively changed it qualitatively, right? Yeah. Because in a command economy, everything is just an internal transfer of goods. So there's no value, and there's no exchange.
It connects quantitative and qualitative, right? Because you can't quantify subjective ordinal preferences.
Yes.
Until
that's how the things that make you an individual, that's how the private things of your heart that you value become part of what. And this is why we have to be careful and ethical and moral in our every action, is because humanity is imitative.
Yes.
And so someone said that, he said, I think it's Coelho. He's not that he's a big philosopher or somebody I read a lot, but he said the world is changed by your example, not by your opinion.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so this is why it is incumbent upon us to have a high standard for ourselves, because we are, and this is what what Kant's categorical imperative is all about, is that you should conduct yourself in a way that if everybody adopted that standard, this is also now how evolutionary stable strategies work. If everyone adopted that strategy, a Schelling point, so to speak, that it would be of the best benefit to everybody. So all of that,
the golden rule, the silver rule, all this stuff.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder if we can bring it. I mean, so what I will say there is that there are words that are there are words that are placeholders for things that are known to be beyond the mind, which is why Hayek uses the word transcendent.
Yeah.
And once you reach that level of transcendence, you can drop any word in and it will kind of make sense. And this is, I want to talk a little bit, this is one thing that has always bothered me a little bit about Bitcoin is, so you have these, Judaism and the God of the Bible is aniconic, which means that at best, you can have symbols that point to the existence of this thing, but the Indian god Shiva is also like this. And this Shivlingam is actually designed to show something emerging out of nothing, but it is part of the iconography, which says that you should never have idols and you cannot conceptualize this thing.
Yes. The Tao, which we call the Tao, is not the Tao.
Yes. The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. And then that must be true of the market, right?
Yeah.
And this is it. The market that can be named is not the true market. And because it's a process that we participate in. And the thing that bothers the rationalists is that why can't we shortcut this? Why can't we just jump to the conclusion? And it's like, if I want to break through that wall, I just have to run at the wall and see. There's no, I can't, I can sit here and do the physics of, which I probably should, because there's a very high level good of me. But this is the thing that bothers individuals. That and it explains existence to a large extent. There are certain computations that cannot be shortcut.
Yeah,
you have to go through the process. And
which is what makes cryptography work, by the way.
Yes.
There's primality of numbers.
Well, let's say something about that right now. Proof of work is proof of work because there's no easy way to invert a hash.
Yeah.
There's no easy. If there were, if proof of work wasn't proof of work, it was just multiplying numbers or was proof of stake or something, you could just shortcut and jump ahead.
Exactly.
And so the proof of work is the proof that you put in the time, and it functions, in fact, as the timer in the clock for Bitcoin with the difficulty index, is the proof that you put in the time. And there is no substitute this is like the kind of things that you explain to kids is like, well, what is the meaning of life? You're going to find out, kid.
There's no substitute for hard work.
You're going to find out this meaning of life. Oh yes. And what I wanted to say is that this is both very interesting. When we reach this point of transcendence, it's very interesting that we can substitute any word, because what we're showing is that the words themselves are meaningless at this point.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to say is that some people equate Bitcoin with the divine. And I think that there are any number of things on earth that show divine qualities, like immutability, that show trust, that show distribution, that show immortality. But that doesn't mean they're the thing in themselves.
That's right.
And so, and I was wondering, there's a book that you've read and that you've done a whole series on, and I'm behind on this. I'm wondering if you can say anything about aesthetics in the context of Lila, and say, what is the role of aesthetics? So in the Hayekian world, in the Fatal Conceit, we've showed instinct, we've shown morals, we've shown reason.
Yeah.
Where does aesthetics fall in that? Because that to me is a big part of how we pave our path forward, but can't explain.
Yeah, well, I don't want to pretend like I'm any expert in aesthetics, but the one definition of beauty that I really appreciate is when appearances reveal truth, that's actually said to be beautiful. And so, yeah, to tie that into Bitcoin specifically, it's like, well, again, we get into the linguistic game of trying to define truth.
Yeah.
But it's either, an accurate portrayal of reality, which is the pretty standard notion of truth when we're talking about symbols. The American pragmatist say that truth is found at the end of inquiry. So it's like useful enough to be true, basically, right? If this map gets me from A to B successfully, is that because the map was true or because the map was useful, right? It gets the line between true and useful gets blurry in the sphere of action, basically.
Yeah.
If it's a means that helps you successfully attain your ends, well, then is it true or is it useful? I don't know. And then the third one is Heidegger defined truth as radical disclosure or unconcealedness, something like that. And as far as I can tell, Bitcoin meets all three of those criteria pretty strongly. It's obviously radically transparent. It's open source software. It is a process of inquiry. You just talked about the mining process, right? It's constantly trying to figure out what's the solution to this puzzle.
How fast can we find this out?
Yeah. And so what is Bitcoin? It's like, it's the tip of that chain, that ongoing process of inquiry. And then when you say an accurate portrayal of reality, it's like, well, I don't know, reality is some kind of amalgam of time, energy, and information. And like Bitcoin is a clock, it produces its own time. Obviously it uses energy in the mining process. And it's the first social institution, if I could use that term, that's composed of perfect information. Like we know what it is, where, the last Bitcoin will be mined in the year 2140. You basically know its supply schedule with perfect certainty, which is an economic concept, perfect information that we've had in theory for a long time, but now we have something pretty damn close to it in practice.
Yeah.
At least. So Bitcoin, if beauty is appearances that reveal truth, Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have an appearance per se. I don't know what you would call that, but it's very closely related to truth, which makes it something that's a beautiful innovation. Sorry, I don't know a lot about aesthetics, but
no, it's all good. I think I misunderstood. I always thought that what Lila did was Persig's book.
I'm sorry, I didn't tie it into Lila at all.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm looking for.
The static and the dynamic, I think, is interesting with Bitcoin because you have this perfect stasis of 21 million, but it's attained through this perfect flow structure, right? This global game of Bitcoin mining. Like Bitcoin's constantly in motion. It's never one thing, right? It's always, the hash rate's always changing. Wallets are always changing. UTXOs are always flowing. And so there's an interesting composite of perfect stasis and perfect dynamism that come together in Bitcoin.
Is there anything about the role of aesthetics in individual decision making? And here's what I'm looking for. Something which Hayek doesn't touch on, okay? Which to me is not only a transcendent faculty, but one that defies reason. Our experience of beauty, we use this word awe, our experience of beauty, our experience sometimes of correctness. I can say this even as somebody who practiced math at one point in their life. Someone said that not all beautiful solutions are true, but when I'm done, if it's not beautiful, I know I did something. So, and this is what I'm looking for: is there any philosophical argument for the role of aesthetics? And here's what I mean: there is, man, I hate to say this, there is such a thing as a Bitcoin aesthetic, okay, and it has to do with minimality. It has to do with distribution, and it absolutely makes Bitcoin different from every other cryptocurrency out there. But I'm trying to understand this line between aesthetic and culture, because I'm looking for more example of choices that we make. Emotion is certainly part of it. Descartes' error, which we discussed, is certainly part of it. And I mean, you literally, this is a fact from brain injuries. If you don't have your emotional faculties, you can't get out of bed. You become a useless human being,
Sure.
even if all your rational faculties are intact. I guess what I'm looking for, is there any philosophical stance on the role of aesthetics in guiding behavior or making decisions?
I mean, I would say at the bottom, like we could talk about markets until we're blue in the face, right? But at the bottom, the market that all of these other markets or all of this extended order exists to serve is the market for human reproduction, right? That is biological men and biological women coming together to create our biological future in the form of new humans.
Yeah.
And so obviously beauty has a major role in that. And yeah, I don't know if you want to boil it down to all that probably gets Freudian at that point, that we're largely driven by these, sexual impulses, drives, whatever it may be. And I'm well beyond my pay grade at this point, but I do think that all markets exist to serve the market for human reproduction and the beauty of the female specifically, but also of the male for females in a different way.
And those aesthetics are very different.
Yes.
Yeah. And the qualities that in the whole, and this is again very difficult to speak for everybody, that males use to judge. It has been said, I think, that males judge beauty on the capacity to replicate, and women judge aesthetics in a male on the capacity to survive.
Yeah, I liked the man's view on the woman is her reproductive fitness, and the woman's view on the man is his productive fitness, something like that. Like
interesting.
His ability to have status and be productive and generous, which gives her the freedom to have a bunch of kids and not worry about the unknown, let's say. And then the man is more focused on the genetic features she brings to the table.
There's a fascinating evolutionary biology talk out there, which makes the point that women are the original entrepreneurs, and that they do the gathering to provide the stable stuff for the bottom of the pot, and to allow the man to take a risk and go out and make a killing, a profit, right? So because, the meat is going to be available very unevenly, but this hunter-gathering is kind of a little bit more stable.
Yeah.
And so here's where this relates directly to Hayek. The procedures that survived over time were the ones that produced the most people who in turn survived over time. And there's no question of right or wrong in that. It's just a matter of what evolved and what happened to work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
And we need to be careful that it doesn't become social Darwinism and survival of the fittest and all these other things, which do seem very cruel. But I think that is ultimately the nature. We live in a reality that we cannot fully comprehend. We are ourselves the products of evolution. Evolution will never stop because conditions are going to keep evolving. And so here's this very amoral, I guess he calls it morality, but
I was just going to say, it is an amoral process. I agree with that, but thank God that morality and, let's say, the division of labor are aligned, right? If we increase the division of labor by being immoral, right? Let's say killing, stealing, whatever, we would be totally.
That seems impossible. Too.
It is impossible, and thank God it is built that way, because otherwise we'd have a serious problem.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Morals are maybe just these other things, these cooperative principles we have discovered through trial and error. You could maybe lump them into the technology stack to some extent. Vervaeke might call them a psychotechnology, like you call language just. It's not necessarily a technology. It's something that we're equipped for, and even animals use sort of proto-language. You've seen ravens will caw, and then they also kind of whisper to their offspring. There's documentaries too that show that they can pass information to their children, like facial recognition and other things. So language seems to be part of reality. And who knows? Who knows, man?
You helped me put it all together there. And what I understood is that the future cannot be designed, but it can be discovered. And our job is to create conditions that maximize the possibility of the discovery of more optimal futures.
Yeah.
And the way we do that is not solely through planning, not even primarily through planning.
Yeah.
What we need to do is create rules that are palatable to other human beings, that other human beings can imitate.
Yes.
So we can participate together in this process of the division of labor, the process of increasing the number of human beings on the planet who are able to live in prosperity that's created by profit.
Yes. And if you take away the power to change the rules, then you take away the power to, dominate basically, or to win in perpetuity. So like with the laws of physics, nobody can change the rules. Therefore, we just all play by the rules, right?
That's right.
We don't have an election every 4 years. We're like, oh, we're going to change the speed of light or the gravitational constant. It's like, well, there's no point because no one knows how to do that. So the ideal social situation is if we had rules that stable. And this is the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. Beautiful, right? It's somehow importing the integrity of the laws of physics into the social domain through proof of work. And so we get something that's law of physics like in the social domain, or in the social institution of money, let's say. And that seems like a really big deal.
I laugh when I see all the Citadel memes, but maybe that's a good place to close, is that language, law, money, science, the extended order, these are all evolved processes. And we are at a very unique point in history where we have a chance to have a money that is accessible to everyone, but not controlled by anyone.
Yes.
And now let's find the sets of rules that allow us to govern ourselves in a way that we aren't exploited for evil wars and other purposes by nation states, but can live together in peace by producing abundance through capitalism and free exchange. I can't think of anything better, and I don't know why it's so hard. But Hayek is here to show us that we need to avoid the conceit of believing that everything which should be part of our future can be designed. In fact, it needs to be evolved.
Yes.
And we're in that process of evolution and have received through our moral traditions much of what is required to project that into the future.
Yes, that's beautifully said. I'll paraphrase. I think it's Bertrand Russell said something like, man first seeks to secure himself against attack, then seeks to attack, basically. Something like that. And so Bitcoin, that is sort of the animalistic, basic, caveman nature, but we've come a long way. We've discovered all these things, these principles to help us cooperate. But I think we actually, even the ethical systems, but Bitcoin is somehow bringing together the ethical and the economic incentives, right? You actually get incentivized ethicality. And I don't know, that's really interesting. And it protects people. It allows you to protect yourself from being attacked, and then
as best as you can.
And not seek to attack, because, well, you can't get anyone's Bitcoin very easily. So you might as well just cooperate and be a productive, good market actor.
I like to say they have bureaucracy and we have cryptography.
So
that's how we win this. Important to note, by the way, that the Bertrand Russells and Einsteins of the world are a cautionary tale. First of all, they were brilliant in their own right. I guess he was one of the authors of Principia, and Einstein, obviously, Theory of Relativity, General Relativity, whole nine. They were, many of them, socialists. And this is important. So Hayek makes a remark about this. He's like, socialism is particularly seductive to individuals who have a strong rational faculty, because it's the law of the instrument. If all you have is reason, you tend to think that everything is, all he has a hammer, you tend to think that everything is a nail. So this is really important. And in this book, there's a great quote which says that nothing could be further from the truth than to believe that an understanding of science makes people more fit at survival or wiser in other areas of life. This is by one of the founders of the scientific method and the application of science. I think the guy who came up with this concept of herd instinct. So that is just to say that somehow the brightest amongst us are the most susceptible to socialism because they believe they're just smart enough to plan everything for everyone. But that is exactly what it is, a conceit or an ego. And actually, that's a really...
I would argue that entrepreneurship inoculates you against that bullshit too. Like,
in what way?
Go get a real job or run a business in the real world, and it'll shake up your big major belief in human reason running everything. Like there's so much where you think, you build a model, you build a business model, and you go, oh, this is going to be the thing, and then it just is destroyed in front of your eyes. You're like, oh, wait a minute. Actually, you need this tinkering process of touching reality, touching the hot stove, learning, repeating. Reason's involved in that, but it's not everything. So these guys that live in the ivory tower their whole lives, their whole career, I think they tend to start to look They start to look at human reason as the be all end all.
Is there anything we missed? Were we able to?
We didn't mention the last two chapters, which are the mysterious world of trade and money and the extended order and population growth.
I'll hit those in reverse order. So population growth, Hayek kind of destroys Malthus. And we've been through that. And he explains, and he in fact emphatically says that there's no example, there's no case ever? Or does he foresee that there would be one where an increase in population led to a decline in standard of living? And he again makes this point about things unseen, that it is not correct to argue because there are lots of poor people that people are poorer because of capitalism. No, there are more people in existence.
Right.
And they start at the lower rung of the ladder because they're still in this process of cultural evolution and evolving and understanding what capitalism is. And it's not capitalism, it's the extended order and how that works. And then for the mysterious world of trade and money, I think this is again this poison mystical idea of this Greco-Roman ideal that you don't trust anything that isn't agriculture. And believe me, I understand that. I feel as somebody who works in technology, like, oh, I wish I just grew corn or something, because nothing seems to work as intended.
But one of the miracles of capitalism is that we've reduced the global workforce, like maybe like 4% of the global workforce is now in agriculture. Yeah,
and the number will keep going down.
But the food per capita is higher than it's ever been and growing, right? Yeah. So it's this extensive specialization. I just want to, there's one small definition in here, because another word that's really hard, there's just a lot of definitions for it, is the word economics, actually. And he had an interesting one in here. I don't know if this is actually a definition, but I just thought it was an interesting take. He said, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. I thought that was really cool. Just the economic process is, it's an organic process that is, there's a rational, human rationality participates in the process, but it's not the whole thing, right? There's a lot of levels beneath it. And so.
Well, and this is why Mises says that an economist can never be a favorite of authoritarians or dictators, because he's always the one saying, nope, that won't work. Yeah. Nope, that won't work. Yeah. And yes, let me end from my side with a question. And it's really a question for the audience. Have we made the case for liberty and an extended order more palatable? And if not, I would love it if people would ask those questions. What still don't they trust about what we call the extended order, which is just Hayek's better and new phrase for capitalism? And yeah, I guess we all have our doubts too. And I wonder, I don't actually anymore. I feel very confident. I feel very confident in the extended order as the way that we create prosperity for the greatest number of people. And the fatal conceit and the economic calculation problem being like two of the ways that we demolish that. But I still wonder, is there a better way? And how do we address, we've tried to in this talk, why social justice and why inequality is not the right way to think about things. We shouldn't be thinking in terms of outcomes. We should be thinking in terms of processes. But yeah, what do you think the remaining questions are that people would have?
No, I think that's a great question in on this sort of the mission you set out in the beginning. And it's a good question to leave with the audience. And I would love to see some answers in the comments. Like, this stuff seems, maybe I'm just excessively relying on my intuition, but I've always known that individual human freedom is the answer to all this bullshit.
Yeah.
And then I feel like I've just been reading a lot of, it sounds like confirmation bias, but every sound argument I've ever heard reconfirms that. I've read Marx, I've read some of this other, it's just nonsense to me. As soon as I start reading Marx, I'm like, this guy's he's fucking batshit crazy. None of this makes any sense at all. I can't believe people have bought into that philosophy. So yeah, I like the question that we should ask the audience what else we and others can do to help make this philosophy more accessible and palatable for people, because as far as I can tell, this is the path forward for the human race.
And what Hayek brings up is that what we need to avoid is the naturalistic fallacy, which is because it's pleasing, it must be good or it must be correct. And you're not saying that explicitly, because individual liberty means higher order liberty means I will have to abide by more and more and more rules that restrain my animalistic instinct. This is so important. Number one.
Instincts,
Number one. Number two, it means that if I wish to profit and survive, I have one way forward, and that is to be of benefit to my fellow human beings.
Yes. Amen to that. Aneesh, thank you so much, man.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks for coming to Miami.
Yep, we'll do it again.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, click here to find more just like it, and here to find our most recent episode. Also, make sure to like this video to help shine light on the corruption of money, and be sure to subscribe to this channel to stay connected.